Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. Okay, so this is something I've never really talked about outside of my family and that one ranger, but it's been eating at me for years, and I guess typing it out might help, or maybe not, I don't know. But here goes. It was July 1st, 2000. My wife Rella and I had decided to take the kids to Oregon Caves National Park in southern Oregon for a day trip. We'd been planning it for a while. The kids were old enough to handle a hike, and we all needed some time away from the city. I'm a psychologist, so I'm usually pretty grounded. But that day messed me up in a way I still can't shake. We started early, driving down from where we lived, and the weather was perfect. Sunny, but not too hot, with that crisp Oregon air that makes everything feel clean. The kids were excited, bouncing around in the back seat, and Rella was her usual calm self, keeping everything together. We got to the park around mid-morning and did the cave tour first. It was cool and damp inside, with those narrow passages and weird rock formations. The kids loved it, pointing at every little stalactite, and I remember feeling relaxed, just enjoying the family time. After the tour, we decided to hike up to see this ancient Douglas fir tree the ranger had mentioned. It was supposed to be massive, something like 1,000 years old, and the trail was supposed to be an easy uphill walk. We packed some water and snacks and headed out. The trail was shaded by tall trees, mostly firs and pines, and the ground was soft with needles. It was quiet. The kind of quiet where you can hear your own footsteps and the distant chatter of the kids. Rel was walking ahead with them, and I was lagging a bit, just taking in the scenery. That's when I first noticed the smell. It hit me out of nowhere, this overpowering skunk-like odor, but worse, like something had died and was rotting nearby. I wrinkled my nose and looked around, thinking maybe it was a dead animal or something. But it was strong. Way stronger than any skunk I'd ever smelled back in Alaska. Yeah, I spent a lot of time in the Alaskan wilderness growing up, so I'm used to weird smells and sounds, but this was different. It was thick, almost oily in the air, and it made my stomach turn. I called out to Rella, "You smell that?" She nodded, looking uneasy, and the kids started complaining about it too. We kept walking, but the smell didn't fade. If anything, it got stronger. Then came the sounds. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe some bird, but it was too rhythmic. This low, guttural woo sound, like someone was hitting a drum but with a voice. It started soft from behind us, and it was spaced out, maybe every 10 seconds or so. Woo, woo, woo. It didn't sound like any animal I knew, not a bear, not a coyote, nothing. My nerves started kicking in hard. I felt this prickle on the back of my neck, and my heart began to beat faster. Rella glanced back at me, her eyes wide, and I could tell she was scared too. The kids were still oblivious, laughing and pointing at bugs, but I knew something was off. The woods felt different suddenly, darker even though it was broad daylight. The trees seemed to close in around us, and that woo sound was getting louder, like whatever was making it was moving closer. I could hear it echoing through the trees, and it was coming from behind us, down the trail we'd just come from. I told Rel to keep the kids moving, and I decided to climb up a small slope to the side of the trail to get a better look. My hands were shaking as I grabbed onto roots and rocks to pull myself up. The ground was loose, and I slipped a couple of times, my knees scraping against the dirt. When I got high enough, I scanned the woods below us. At first, I didn't see anything, just trees and shadows. But then movement caught my eye. About 100 yards back, something was moving through the underbrush. It was tall, way taller than a man, and dark, covered in what looked like shaggy hair. It was walking on two legs, not like a bear at all. Bears have a lumbering gait, but this thing moved smoothly, almost gracefully, like it belonged there. My breath caught in my throat. I squinted, trying to make out details. It was maybe 7 or 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a human-like build, but bulkier like an ape. The hair was dark brown or black, and it shimmered in the patches of sunlight. I've seen bears in Alaska, grizzlies, black bears, and this was no bear. Bears don't walk upright like that for long, and they don't have that kind of posture. This thing was purposeful, like it was tracking something or us. Then it stopped and turned its head. I couldn't see its face clearly from that distance, but I felt its gaze lock onto me, or not me, onto my family on the trail below. Rel and the kids were still walking, unaware. The creature just stood there, staring. I felt a cold dread wash over me. My skin went clammy, and I could feel sweat beading on my forehead, despite the cool air. This wasn't curiosity. It was a predator assessing its prey. I knew in that moment what it was. Bigfoot. I'd heard stories, laughed them off, but now I was seeing it, and it was real. I scrambled back down the slope, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. My legs felt weak, and I almost tripped in my hurry. When I reached the trail, Rel was waiting, her face pale. "What is it?" she whispered. I didn't want to scare the kids, so I pulled her aside and said, "There's something out there. Big, walking on two legs. It's watching us." I kept my voice low, but it shook. I could see the fear in her eyes. But she stayed calm. She's always been the strong one. We decided I'd stay behind, hidden near the trail, to keep an eye out while she led the kids forward to the tree. I didn't want to leave them, but I also didn't want whatever that thing was to get closer without me knowing. The kids were asking questions. Why are we stopping? What's wrong? But Rel distracted them, saying we were almost there. I found a spot behind a thick tree trunk where I could crouch down and peer through the branches. The ground was damp, and I could feel the moisture seeping through my jeans. My hands were still trembling, and I had to clutch my knees to steady myself. I listened intently. The woo sounds had stopped, and the smell was fading a bit, but the silence was worse. It was too quiet. No birds, no rustling, nothing. Like the forest was holding its breath. I kept scanning the trees, expecting to see that dark shape again. Every shadow looked like it was moving, and my mind played tricks on me. I'd think I saw something, but it was just a branch swaying. Time dragged on. It felt like hours, but it was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. I could hear Rele and the kids ahead, their voices getting fainter, and I prayed they'd be okay. My thoughts were racing. What if it circled around? What if there was more than one? I remembered stories from Alaska about hikers who'd gone missing, and I felt a surge of panic. I'm not a religious man, but I found myself whispering, "Please, just let them be safe." My mouth was dry, and I could taste the fear, metallic and sour. I kept looking back at where I'd seen the creature, but nothing moved. The woods were still, too still. After what felt like forever, I couldn't stand it anymore. I crept out from behind the tree and hurried up the trail to catch up with Rel and the kids. They were at the Douglas fir tree, which was huge, towering over everything, with gnarled bark and a massive trunk. The kids were touching it, amazed, but Rel saw me coming and her face tightened. I shook my head slightly, letting her know I hadn't seen anything more, but the fear was still there, buzzing under my skin. We didn't stay long. I urged everyone to head back to the park headquarters, and we moved quickly, almost jogging at times. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that thing following us, but the trail was empty. The smell was gone, and the sounds didn't return. By the time we reached the parking lot, the sun was starting to dip lower, casting long shadows. I felt a little relief, but the dread was still there, coiled in my gut. I went straight to the ranger station, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold the door open. The ranger was a young guy, maybe in his 20s, and he looked bored until he saw my face. I must have been pale as a ghost. I started talking, my words tumbling out fast. I told him everything. The smell, the sounds, what I saw. I emphasized that I'm a psychologist, that I know the difference between reality and imagination, that I've spent time in the wilderness and know what bears look like. I was practically begging him to believe me, my voice cracking. I could feel tears welling up, but I choked them back. I kept saying, it was real, I saw it, it was staring right at us. The ranger listened, but he had that skeptical look, like he'd heard it all before. He took down my information and said he'd file a report, but I could tell he didn't really buy it. That made it worse, like I was crazy, but I know what I saw. Rella was with the kids, trying to calm them down, and when I joined them, she hugged me tight. I could feel her trembling too. We drove home in silence, the kids asleep in the back, and I kept replaying it in my head, that tall, dark figure, the way it turned and stared, the fear of being exposed, out there with no protection for my family. It's stuck with me ever since. I've never gone back to that park, and I doubt I ever will. Sometimes at night I'll wake up sweating, hearing that woo sound in my dreams. I don't know what it was, but I know it was real, and I know it saw us. That's the part that haunts me. The feeling that we were being watched, hunted almost. I can't explain it, and I don't think I ever will. Dishimna, Story 2. It was one of those crisp November mornings in the high desert, the kind where the air feels thin and sharp in your lungs, and the sun hasn't yet warmed the frost off the pinyon pines. November 7th, 1981. I remember the date, because it was the day everything I thought I knew about the world just got up and walked away. We were hunting, my family and I, up in the mountains southwest of Cove, on the reservation. It was me, my dad, and my 2 older cousins. We'd been up since before first light, our breath pluming in the beam of the flashlight, the familiar weight of my old .30-30 rifle a comfort in my hands. The plan was simple, like it always was. We'd head up into the higher draws, where the mule deer liked to bed down in the thick stands of oak and juniper. We'd spread out, try to push something towards each other. It was a ritual, something we'd done 100 times. The sun was fully up by then, maybe 9 in the morning. It was cold, but the kind of cold you can work with, you know? You move around and you warm up. We'd been walking for a couple hours, not seeing much, just some old tracks. My cousins, they wanted to swing wide, follow a dry creek bed that looped around the base of this big rocky hill. It was a longer route, but it was easier walking. I was younger, more impatient. I saw the hill, steep as it was, and figured I could just go straight up and over. It would cut a good 20-30 minutes off the time, and I'd meet them on the other side. A shortcut. Stupidest decision I ever made. I told them I'd see them on the other side, and I started climbing. The ground was loose, all shale and gravel, and the manzanita bushes clawed at my jeans. It was hard going, and I was breathing heavy, my heart thumping a steady rhythm in my chest. About halfway up, I stopped to catch my breath, leaning against a gnarled old juniper tree. The silence up there was different. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of the woods. It was a thick, heavy silence, the kind that feels like it's pressing in on your ears. It felt wrong. I don't know why I did it. Maybe to break the tension, to hear a human sound. I cupped my hands around my mouth and I called out just aloud, "Hey!" Not really expecting an answer, just wanting to hear something. My voice didn't echo, it just got swallowed up by that dense, woolly silence. And then, from down below me, in the thick oak brush that choked the slope, there was a sound. It wasn't a crack, it was a crash, a violent, snapping, tearing sound, like something big was just plowing through the brush, not caring what it broke. My heart, which had just settled down, immediately jumped into my throat. I froze, my hand tightening on the rifle stock. I remember thinking it was an elk, a big bull, maybe spooked, but elk don't move like that. They're graceful, even when they're running. This was brutal. I took a couple careful steps to the edge of the little outcrop I was on, peering down into the tangle of branches and leaves. The crashing had stopped, but I could hear movement, a steady, rustling thump, thump, thump. And then I saw it. The brush parted maybe 40 yards down the slope, and this thing stepped out onto a game trail. It was walking on 2 feet. That was the first thing that hit me. 2 feet, just like a man, but it wasn't a man. It was huge. Its shoulders were impossibly wide, rounded and powerful, covered in this coarse, shaggy hair that was black, but with a kind of reddish tinge to it where the sun hit. Its arms were long, swinging slightly at its sides, and they were thick like tree limbs. I couldn't see its face clearly. It was angled away from me and the brush was in the way. But I got an impression of a heavy, sloping brow. It moved with a purpose, a steady, ground-eating stride that was completely unhurried. It didn't look around. It just walked, crossing the trail and heading into the thicker timber on the other side. It was so fluid, so natural. That's what made it so terrifying. It belonged there in a way I suddenly knew I did not, and then the smell hit me. It's a smell I can still call up in my memory, even now, all these years later. It was a wave of pure, physical stench, a heavy, musky odor, like a wet dog that's been sleeping in a rotten log. It was the smell of old animal hair, of damp earth, of something decaying. It was so strong, so pungent, it felt like a solid thing in the air. It made my eyes water and my stomach clench. I actually took a step back, my boots scuffing on the gravel, the instinct to get away from that smell overriding everything else. My rifle was in my hands. I don't even remember raising it. It was just there. The cold metal of the barrel, a stark contrast to the sweat on my palms. My finger found the trigger guard. I had a clear shot. Its broad black back was right there in my sights. I could have taken it. I should have. Some part of my brain screamed. It was a predator, an animal, and I had the drop on it. But I couldn't squeeze the trigger. I couldn't because of the way it walked. That human-like gait. It wasn't a bear. Bears have a lumbering, pigeon-toed walk on their hind legs. This was different. It was a stride, a confident, two-legged walk. What if it was a person, some crazy hermit living out in the woods? What if I shot a man in the back? My mind was racing, a frantic, terrified debate happening in the space of 2 heartbeats. But I knew, deep in my gut, I knew it wasn't a man. No man was built like that. No man smelled like that. And while I was frozen there, caught between terror and reason, it just vanished. It stepped into the shadow of a big ponderosa pine and didn't come out the other side. The thick undergrowth just swallowed it up. 1 second it was there, a massive dark shape moving through the world, and the next there was nothing, just the empty trail and the swaying branches where it had passed. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before. The smell was still there, clinging to the inside of my nose, the back of my throat. I lowered my rifle, my arms trembling. I stood there for maybe a full minute, just staring at the spot where it had disappeared, trying to make my brain process what my eyes had just seen. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. That's when the new fear started, cold and sharp in my gut. The fear of being watched. I had to get off that hill. I had to get to my family. I turned and started scrambling back down the way I had come, but faster now, reckless. I was slipping on the loose rock, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I wasn't thinking about being quiet anymore. I just had to move. And I heard it. Behind me, from the direction I'd just come, there was a sound. Not a crash this time. It was a subtle sound. The sound of something moving through the brush, keeping pace. A soft crunch of a footstep on dry leaves. A quiet snap of a twig. I stopped dead. My heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would crack them. The sound stopped too. I took another few steps, faster now, my boots skidding on the gravel. Crunch, swish, snap. It was matching me, step for step. Pure primal fear is a physical thing. It's not an emotion, it's a substance. It flooded my veins, turning my blood to ice water. It tightened my scalp and made the hair on my arms and neck stand straight up. My mouth went completely dry. This wasn't the startled fear of seeing something strange. This was the deep, ancient fear of being prey. Something was following me, something that had seen me and was now tracking me. I tried to tell myself it was a deer, a coyote, anything else, but deer don't stop when you stop. Coyotes don't have the patience for that. This was intelligent. This was deliberate. I started to run. I don't mean a jog, I mean a full-on panic-stricken sprint down a steep, treacherous hillside. It was stupid. I could have broken my ankle, my neck, but I didn't care. The only thing that mattered was putting distance between me and whatever was in that brush. Branches whipped at my face, tearing at my jacket. I didn't feel them. All I could feel was the burning in my lungs and the crushing weight of the thing behind me. And it kept pace. I could hear it, a relentless presence just out of sight, moving through the thickets with an ease I couldn't match. It wasn't crashing. It was just there, a shadow moving parallel to me. I'd catch a glimpse of a dark shape shifting between the trees, but when I'd snap my head to look, there'd be nothing. The smell came back, stronger now, that wet, rotting animal smell. It was so close, it was right there. I couldn't take it anymore. The fear was a screaming thing in my head. I skidded to a stop again, spinning around, bringing my rifle up. I couldn't see anything, just the dense, silent forest. But I could feel it. I could feel its eyes on me. I didn't aim. I just pointed the barrel in the general direction of the noise and the smell, angled up so I wouldn't hit anything on the ground, and I pulled the trigger. The boom of the rifle shot was deafening in the silence. It echoed off the hills, a sharp, angry crack that shattered the stillness. Birds erupted from the trees everywhere, cawing and flapping, and in the immediate ringing silence that followed the shot, the following sounds stopped. Completely. I didn't wait. I turned and I ran. I ran, like hell was opening up behind me. I didn't look back. I just focused on the ground in front of me, my legs pumping, my lungs on fire. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like an eternity. All I knew was I had to get to the creek bed, to my cousins. I finally burst out of the tree line and stumbled down the bank, my boots splashing into the shallow, icy water. I saw them then, my two cousins, maybe 100 yards away. They had their rifles up, looking startled, having heard the shot. They saw the sheer, unadulterated terror on my face as I stumbled towards them, gasping for air, my clothes torn, my face scratched and bleeding. I collapsed onto the gravel bar, my whole body shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't speak. I just pointed back up the hill, my hand trembling. They asked me what was wrong, if I was okay, if I'd shot something. I just shook my head over and over. I couldn't form the words. How could I? How could I tell them I'd seen a monster and that it had hunted me? We got back to the truck an hour later. I didn't say a word the whole way. I just sat in the cab, staring out the window, seeing that wide-shouldered shape walking, smelling that god-awful smell, feeling those unseen eyes on my back. I never went hunting on that part of the reservation again. I never even went camping. To this day, the smell of wet wool or damp earth can sometimes bring it all back, that icy fist of fear clenching in my chest. I never told my dad. I never told anyone, not the whole story. What would I say? I saw something in the woods that I can't explain, something that walked like a man but wasn't, something that decided to follow me for a while. They'd think I was crazy. Sometimes I think I'm crazy, but I know what I saw, I know what I smelled, and I know, with a certainty that has never faded, that for those few long minutes on that cold November hillside, I was not the hunter, I was the hunted, and whatever it was that was following me, it let me go. I fired a shot into the air, a warning, a plea, a declaration that I was still a threat, and it just stopped. It decided to let me go. I've spent my whole life wondering why. I still don't have an answer. I just have the memory and the smell and the chilling knowledge that I was in the presence of something I will never, ever understand. Story 3. All right, so I've been sitting on this for a while, and I don't really know how to start, but I need to get it out. I'm still kind of shaken up, and my hands are a little unsteady typing this, so bear with me. This happened last summer in Washington, up in the Cascades. My friend and I are both big into rock climbing. We've been doing it for years, and we're used to being out in the middle of nowhere, dealing with rough terrain and weird sounds. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared us for what went down that day. We'd planned this trip for weeks. It was supposed to be a straightforward day hike to a trailhead that leads to some solid climbing spots. We'd been there before, but this time we decided to try a less traveled route, one that cuts deeper into the forest. The weather was perfect, sunny but not too hot, with that crisp mountain air that makes you feel alive. We started early, around 7 in the morning, parking the car at the edge of this dirt road that barely qualifies as a road. From there, it was about a 2-hour hike to the trailhead where the real climbing begins. The first part of the hike was normal. We were joking around, talking about routes we wanted to try, just enjoying the silence of the woods. It's one of those places where the trees are so thick you can't see more than 50 feet in any direction, and the ground is covered in this spongy layer of pine needles and dead leaves. Everything smells like damp earth and pine sap. We'd been walking for maybe an hour when things started to feel off. At first, it was just little things, the kind of stuff you shrug off. Birds would stop chirping suddenly, and the woods would go dead silent for a minute or two before the sounds picked back up. I've spent enough time outdoors to know that's not totally unusual, but it was happening more often than normal. Then came the wood knocks. I heard the first one from off to our left, deep in the trees. It was this sharp, hollow sound, like someone hitting a dead log with a big stick. It wasn't loud, but it carried through the quiet, and it made the hair on my arms stand up. My friend heard it too. He turned his head and gave me this look like, what was that? But he's a hardcore skeptic, always has been. He's the type who laughs off Bigfoot stories and says it's all bears or hikers messing around. So he just shrugged and said, probably a branch falling. I wanted to believe him, but it didn't sound like any branch I'd ever heard. It was too deliberate, too clean. A few minutes later, there was another knock, this time from our right. It was farther away, but it had the same quality, hollow and sharp. Then almost immediately after, we heard faint branch snaps, like something heavy was moving through the underbrush. Not crashing, but careful, like it was trying to be quiet. That's when I started to feel that prickly sensation on the back of my neck. I've been in woods where animals are moving around, and this didn't sound like a deer or a bear. Deer are light and quick, bears are loud and clumsy when they're not trying to hide. This was different, slow, methodical, like whatever it was knew we were there and was keeping pace with us. I decided to do something stupid. I'd heard stories about people knocking on wood and getting responses, so I found a solid-looking branch on the ground, picked it up, and knocked it against a nearby tree trunk. 3 quick raps. The sound echoed a little, and then nothing. For about 10 seconds, it was dead quiet. Then, from straight ahead, maybe 100 yards away, came 3 knocks in response. Exactly 3, same rhythm as mine. My heart just dropped into my stomach. My friend's eyes went wide, and he stopped walking. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, and his voice was tight. I nodded, and I could feel my own heart hammering against my ribs. That's when I pulled out my phone. I fumbled with it because my hands were shaking, but I managed to open the voice recorder app. I held it up and said, "Listen." We stood there for a minute, not moving, just listening. The woods were silent again, but then there was another knock, closer this time, from the same direction as the response. I got it on recording. I still have the file, and I've listened to it a dozen times since. It's eerie as hell. After that, we decided to keep moving, but slower now, and we weren't talking anymore. Every little sound made us jump. A squirrel rustling in the leaves, the wind rustling the branches overhead. It felt like the woods were watching us. We'd gone another couple 100 yards when we heard it again, another wood knock, but this one was different. It was followed by this rhythmic tapping sound, like someone was hitting rocks together. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. It was steady, almost musical, but in a creepy way. It sounded like it was coming from above us, maybe from a ridge or something, but we couldn't see anything through the trees. That rhythmic sound is what really got to my friend. He's always been the rational one, but I saw the color drain from his face. He grabbed my arm and said, "We need to go back. Now." His voice was low and urgent, and I'd never heard him sound like that before. Normally he'd be making jokes, but there was no humor in his eyes now, just pure fear. So we turned around and started hurrying back the way we came. We weren't running, but we were walking fast, almost jogging, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. The whole time, those knocks and taps kept happening, sometimes from one direction, sometimes from another, like whatever it was moving around us. It felt like we were being herded, or maybe just toyed with. My skin was crawling, and I could feel sweat trickling down my back, even though it wasn't that hot out. Every time we heard a sound, we'd freeze for a second, then push on faster. I remember thinking, this can't be real, but it was. And it was happening right then. After about 20 minutes of this, we came to a part of the trail that opened up a bit, a small clearing with fewer trees. That's when we saw the first stick structure. It was off to the side of the path, maybe 10 feet away. At first, I thought it was just some fallen branches, but then I realized they were arranged deliberately. It was like a crude lean-to, made of thick sticks propped up against a tree, with smaller branches woven through them. It wasn't something that could have happened naturally. Someone or something had built it. My friend pointed at it, and his hand was trembling. "What the hell is that?" he said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. We stopped to look closer, and that's when we saw the tracks. In the soft dirt near the structure, there were footprints. They were huge, way bigger than any human foot I've ever seen. I wear a size 11 shoe, and these were at least half again as long and wide, with what looked like 5 toes. The impressions were deep, like whatever made them was heavy. The weirdest part was that they didn't look like bear tracks. Bears have claws, and these were more human-like, but not quite. We just stood there staring, and I felt this cold dread wash over me. My friend, who'd been skeptical this whole time, was now as pale as a ghost. He kept shaking his head and muttering, "No way, no way." We didn't stick around to investigate further. We started backtracking even faster, almost at a run now. The knocks had stopped, but the silence was almost worse because it felt heavy, oppressive, like something was waiting. We didn't talk much on the way back. We were both too freaked out. I remember the sound of our breathing, ragged and loud in the quiet, and the crunch of our boots on the trail. Every shadow in the trees seemed to move, and I kept expecting to see something step out onto the path ahead of us. It took us what felt like forever to get back to the car. When we finally reached it, we both just stood there for a minute, catching our breath. My friend leaned against the car door, and his hands were shaking so bad he could barely get the keys out. We got in, locked the doors, and sat there for a while without saying anything. I could still hear my heart pounding in my ears. We drove away without even discussing it, and it wasn't until we were back on the main road that he finally spoke. He said, "I don't know what that was, but it wasn't a bear." And that was it. He hasn't brought it up since, and neither have I, but I know it changed him. He's not the same skeptic he used to be. To this day, I can't explain what happened. I've gone over it in my head 1,000 times, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was other hikers or some kind of animal, but nothing fits. The knocks, the responses, the rhythmic tapping, the stick structures, the tracks. It all adds up to something I don't understand. I still have the recording, and sometimes I listen to it, and it sends chills down my spine every time. Whatever was out there that day, it felt intelligent, and it knew we were there. I don't think I'll ever go back to that part of the woods again. Story 4. He was so proud of his car. It was a 1940 Ford Deluxe Coupe, a deep maroon color that shone like a jewel. He'd saved up for it himself, working after school and on weekends down at the mill. That car was his freedom, and that day, it was ours. We packed a wicker basket his mother had lent us, thick ham sandwiches on her homemade bread, a thermos of lemonade, a little tin of sugar cookies. It was simple, but it felt like a feast. We drove up the winding roads towards Mount Adams. The air coming through the open windows was clean and smelled of pine and warm earth. He had one hand on the wheel and the other resting on my knee, and I remember thinking I had never been so happy. It was a physical feeling, a lightness in my chest, a constant, quiet smile on my face that I couldn't have wiped off if I'd tried. We found our spot after about an hour of driving, pulling off onto a little dirt track that wasn't much more than a pair of ruts in the grass. It led to a partial clearing, a wide, sunny space ringed by tall, dark fir trees. On one side, the land sloped down, giving us a breathtaking view of the valley below, all green and gold in the afternoon sun. That's why they called the town Grand View, I guess. It really was. We spread out an old wool blanket. Its red and black patterns faded from years of use. The grass was long and soft underneath. We ate our sandwiches, the mustard sharp and tangy, and drank the cold lemonade. We talked about everything and nothing, about the wedding, about maybe moving to Vancouver for him to find work at the shipyards, about what we'd name our kids someday. It was all dreams, the kind you only talk about when you're young, and you believe the future is something you can build with your own two hands. After we ate, we just lay there on the blanket for a long time, watching the clouds drift by. The sun was warm on my skin, and the only sounds were the buzz of insects and the gentle sigh of the wind through the high branches. I remember the rough texture of the wool blanket against my bare arms and the solid, comforting weight of him beside me. I felt safe, completely and utterly safe. That's the part that makes what happened later so hard to reconcile. That feeling of safety just got ripped away, and it never really came back. The sun started to dip lower in the sky, casting long, stretched-out shadows from the trees. The air began to cool, that quick mountain chill that comes on as soon as the sun loses its strength. We knew we had to pack up and head back. The road down the mountain wasn't one you wanted to be on after dark. We started gathering our things. I folded the blanket, shaking off the bits of grass and pine needles, feeling a little sad that the day was ending. He was putting the thermos and the empty cookie tin back into the wicker basket. He walked over to the car, which was parked about 20 feet away, its driver's side door still hanging open, to put the basket on the back seat. I was standing there, holding the folded blanket, taking one last look around the clearing. It was a habit my mom had drilled into me. Always do an idiot check, she'd say. Make sure you're not leaving anything behind. So I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the edge of the trees, the spot where we'd had our picnic, the path we'd driven in on. That's when I saw it. My brain didn't process it at first. It was just a movement, a shape of wrongness in the periphery of my vision, over near the tree line on the far side of the clearing, maybe 60, 70 yards away. I turned my head to look properly, and my breath just stopped in my throat. It was a creature. There's no other word for it. It was tall, so much taller than a man, and built thick and powerful like a wrestler or a dockworker. Its entire body was covered in hair, a deep, shaggy black that seemed to absorb the fading light. It wasn't loping or ambling. It was walking, striding quickly and purposefully, parallel to us, heading for the deeper part of the forest. Its legs were long, and it moved with a fluid, powerful gait that was nothing like a bear. A bear is top-heavy. It shuffles. This thing, It moved with a sense of purpose, a straight-backed, confident stride that was chillingly human. It must have been 7, maybe 8 feet tall. The muscles in its shoulders and back bunched and shifted under that dark coat with every step. Its arms were long, swinging at its sides, and they ended in what looked like hands, not paws. I didn't see its face clearly. It was turned away from me, focused on where it was going. But the profile was heavy and blunt, not a snout. The sheer speed of it was what froze me solid. It covered the ground in these huge, ground-eating strides, its feet making no sound that I could hear from that distance over the thumping of my own heart. It was a creature of pure, raw power, and it moved with an intent that felt ancient and completely alien. It was there, in my field of vision, for maybe 3-4 seconds at most. But in that sliver of time, it burned itself onto the back of my eyelids forever. A cold jolt, like I'd been dipped in ice water, shot down my spine. The feeling of safety I'd had just moments before evaporated, leaving a hollow, terrified pit in my stomach. "Hey!" I yelled, my voice coming out as a strangled croak. I pointed a trembling finger towards the trees. "Hey, look!" My fiancé was still by the car. He turned, his face curious, and followed my pointing finger. He slowed his movements, squinting into the distance. "Look at what?" he asked, his voice calm, normal. "There! Right there! Walking into the trees!" I was practically shouting, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I felt dizzy. He stared for another few seconds, then shook his head and looked back at me, a small, patient smile on his face. "I don't see anything, honey. Probably just a bear. They come down this time of day to look for berries." "It wasn't a bear," I said, my voice shaking. I could still feel the chill on my skin. "It was walking on 2 legs. It was huge. He came over to me and put his hands on my shoulders. They felt warm and solid." "It was a bear," he said gently, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You see one standing up on its hind legs sometimes. It can look funny from far away. Trick of the light. It's gone now. Whatever it was. Don't let it spook you." I wanted to argue. I wanted to scream that I knew what I saw, that I knew the difference between a foraging bear and that, the way it moved. It wasn't a clumsy, curious animal. Its movement had a direction, a power, an intelligence to it that was terrifying. It wasn't looking for berries. It was going somewhere, but I looked at his face, at his easy, dismissive smile. This was our engagement picnic, the happiest day of our lives so far. I saw the concern in his eyes, but it was concern for me being silly, for getting worked up over nothing. I didn't want to be that girl, the hysterical one who ruins a perfect day with wild imaginings. I didn't want our first memory as an engaged couple to be a fight about something he hadn't even seen. So I swallowed the lump of fear in my throat. I forced a weak smile and nodded. "Yeah," I whispered, my voice still unsteady. "You're probably right. A bear. Just startled me." "That's my girl," he said, and he leaned in and kissed my forehead. The gesture that had felt so comforting all day now felt hollow, like he was patting a child on the head after a bad dream. We got into the car. He started the engine, and the familiar sound usually soothed me, but now it just felt like we were running away. I kept my eyes glued to the passenger window, staring at the tree line where the thing had disappeared. The shadows between the trunks looked deeper now, impenetrable and watchful. He chatted easily on the drive home, about the picnic, about the view, about what movie we might see next weekend. I answered in monosyllables, my mind 1,000 miles away, trapped in that clearing. I could still see the ripple of muscle under the black hair, the effortless, powerful stride. I could feel the primal fear it had ignited in me, a fear that was old and deep, something my bones understood, even if my mind didn't. He never brought it up again. For him, it was a non-event, a momentary distraction. For me, it was a fracture in my reality. The image of that creature didn't fade with time. It got clearer. In the years that followed, through the war, through our marriage, through the birth of our children, that thing was always there in the back of my mind. I'd see a tall, dark shape out of the corner of my eye in a crowd, and my heart would skip a beat. I'd read a story in a magazine about strange tracks found in the woods, and my hands would go cold. I never went back to Mount Adams. He suggested it a few times for anniversaries, for a drive to see the fall colors, but I always found an excuse. I couldn't. I knew if I went back, I would just stand there in that clearing, looking at that tree line, waiting for it to walk out again. He passed away 5 years ago. We had a good life, a long life. He was a good man. But I never told him, not once in all those decades, that I was sure, absolutely certain, that what I saw that afternoon was not a bear. It was something else. Something that walked like a man, but wasn't a man. Something that moved through those ancient woods with a purpose I couldn't begin to understand. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind sounds a certain way, I can still feel that ice-cold chill down my spine, and I can see it as clearly as I did that day. A tall, black, muscular shape, striding quickly and silently into the shadows, forever leaving me alone with the memory and a question that will never, ever have an answer. Story 5. It was the kind of morning that makes you glad to be alive, the kind that makes the hard work of living off this land feel worth it. The air was cool and clean, smelling of damp earth and pine, and the sun was just starting to burn through the mist hanging over the Tugelo River. We were a party of 7, a mix of men from my settlement and a native hunting party we'd joined up with east of the river. We'd been out for 3 days, and the hunting had been good. Just the day before, we'd brought down a fine buck, a big one that would feed all of us and then some. We'd dressed it and left it back at camp, hanging high from a limb, thinking it was safe. We had to range further out to find more game, so we left the old man, one of the natives, to guard the camp. He was a quiet one, his face a map of wrinkles, but his eyes were sharp. He didn't say much, but he knew these woods better than any of us. We figured with him there, and the deer hung up good. Nothing would touch it. We came back that evening, tired but in good spirits, talking about the turkey we'd spotted for the next day's hunt. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. It wasn't the normal, peaceful quiet of the woods settling in for the night. This was a dead quiet, the kind that feels heavy, like a weight on your chest. The birds weren't singing, the insects weren't chirping. Nothing. Then I saw the old man. He was sitting with his back against a big pine, his knees drawn up to his chest. His hands were shaking. He wasn't just sitting, he was coiled tight, like a spring. His eyes were wide, staring at nothing or maybe at everything at once. The deer was gone. The rope we'd used to hang it was just dangling there, chewed through. Not cut, chewed. We all started talking at once, asking him what happened if a bear had come. He just shook his head, slow, his eyes not really seeing us. It took him a long time to find his voice, and when he did, it was a dry, raspy whisper. He told us it wasn't a bear. He said it came out of the deep woods just as the sun was getting low, moving through the shadows of the trees, so you almost couldn't see it until it was right there. He said it stood 7 feet tall, if it was an inch, and it was covered head to toe in a shaggy dark hair, like a bear's but longer, almost like a mangy buffalo. It walked on 2 legs, erect, just like a man, but it wasn't a man. The thing that stuck in my head, the detail that made my skin go cold, was what he said about its face. He said it didn't have a proper mouth. Its mouth was in its chin, a great lipless gash right there in the bottom of its face, and it had claws. He held up his hands, curving his fingers, showing us. Great, thick claws, longer than a man's fingers. He said it just walked into the camp, calm as you please, like it owned the place. It looked right at him where he was hiding, frozen, behind a fallen log. It didn't growl or roar. It just looked at him, with these dark, deep-set eyes, and he said in that moment he knew he was nothing to it. Less than nothing. It was an old, cold intelligence in that look, something that didn't belong in these woods. Then it reached up, snagged the deer with one of those clawed hands, snapped the rope like it was a piece of thread, threw the whole carcass over its shoulder, and walked back into the trees. It never made a sound. Not one. We all fell silent then. You could hear the fire crackling. I looked at the other men, and I saw my own fear reflected in their faces. This wasn't a bear, this was something else, something we didn't have a name for. The native men were talking low and fast among themselves, their voices tight with a fear I'd never heard in them before. These were men who laughed at panthers and tracked wolves for sport. They were scared, truly, deeply scared, and that scared me more than the old man's story. We decided right then and there that we weren't going to let this thing steal our food. We were hunters, not prey. So we made a plan. We would all stay in camp that night. We'd build up the fire, keep a watch, and if it came back, we'd be ready for it. We had our rifles, good Kentucky long rifles, and we knew how to use them. The night that fell was the longest of my life. The dark outside our firelight felt thick, solid. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my heart jump into my throat. We didn't talk much. We just sat there listening, our rifles across our laps. The firelight danced on our faces, making shadows leap and twist on the trees around us. I remember the feel of the carved wood of my rifle stock, smooth and familiar under my hand. I remember the cold weight of the metal trigger guard against my finger. I remember the taste of coffee, bitter and strong, but I couldn't tell you if I drank 1 cup or 10. Time stretched and warped. It felt like we'd been sitting there for a week. It must have been a few hours past midnight when the woods went quiet again. That same dead, heavy silence from before. The hair on my arms stood up. One of the natives pointed, a slow, deliberate movement, towards the tree line to the north. It was there. It was just standing at the edge of the darkness, maybe 30 yards away, half hidden by the trunk of a massive oak. It was bigger than I'd imagined, so much bigger. The old man hadn't been lying. It was towering, a giant shape of matted dark hair, and it was standing on 2 legs, perfectly balanced. I could see the powerful slope of its shoulders, the long arms that hung down past its knees. I couldn't see its face clearly, just a darker patch in the shadow of its head, but my mind filled in the detail the old man had given us, the mouth in the chin. It was just watching us, not moving, just observing. My breath caught in my chest. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic, panicked rhythm. This wasn't like staring down a bear. A bear has an anger you can understand. This thing, its stillness was worse than any charge. It felt like it was thinking, calculating. Then it took a step forward into the ring of firelight. It moved with a strange, fluid grace that was utterly wrong for something so massive. It didn't lumber. It flowed, and it was heading for the spot where we'd hung a haunch of venison we'd saved, a decoy. That's when we moved. There was no signal. We just all knew. We raised our rifles as one. The world seemed to slow down. I saw the muscles in its back bunch under that thick hide as it reached for the meat. I didn't even think. I just picked a spot, exhaled half a breath like my daddy taught me, and squeezed the trigger. The roar of my rifle was deafening in the silent night. The kick against my shoulder was a solid, reassuring thump. I saw a puff of dust and hair explode from the thing's back, just below its shoulder blade. My ball had hit. It let out a sound then, the first sound I'd heard it make. It wasn't a roar. It was a deep, guttural, choked bellow of pain and surprise, a sound that seemed to come from the bottom of its guts. It dropped the venison haunch it was holding and spun around. When it turned, the firelight fell full on its front and I saw it. I saw the mouth. It was just as the old man had said, a raw, red, horizontal slash right across its chin, and it was open now, showing dark inside. Its eyes, small and deep-set, blazed with a fury that was purely terrifyingly intelligent. It was looking right at us, at me, and I knew it knew we were the ones who had hurt it. That's when the other 6 rifles went off, a volley of fire and smoke that tore through the night. The shots hit it in the breast, a tight grouping that spoke of a lifetime of hunting. The impact drove it back a step. It made that horrible choking sound again, a wet, gurgling noise now. It stood there for a second, swaying, its claws flexing at its sides. Then its legs buckled, and it crashed to the ground like a felled tree. The earth shook. For a long time, nobody moved. We just stood there, rifles smoking, staring at the huge, still form lying in the dirt. The smell of gunpowder was thick in the air, mixing with the scent of pine and something else. Something musky and wild, like a wet dog, but stronger, more pungent. It was the creature's smell. Slowly, cautiously, we approached it. It was dead. There was no doubt. The shots had torn through its chest, and a dark, almost black blood was seeping out, soaking into the dirt. I stood over it, my rifle still clutched in my hands, and I felt a mix of triumph and a sick, cold dread. We had killed it. But what was it? Up close it was even more horrifying. The hair was coarse like a horse's mane and thick. Its feet were huge, splayed things with 5 toes. Its hands, they were almost human, but the fingers were too long and those claws were real. Thick and curved, like a panther's but bigger, and the face. I forced myself to look. The mouth in the chin was real. It was a nightmare given flesh. We had just killed a nightmare. We didn't know what to do. We just stood around it, not talking. The adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving us hollow and shaky. We decided to leave it there for the night. We'd figure out what to do in the morning. Nobody slept. We just sat by the fire, keeping it blazing high, and we watched the dark shape of the creature, a blacker shadow against the dark ground. A few hours later, just as the sky was beginning to lighten from black to a deep dark blue, we heard it. It started as a long, drawn-out call from far off, deep in the woods across the river. It wasn't a howl, not like a wolf. It was a hallow, a word I'd only ever heard used for human shouts, but this was no human sound. It was a deep, booming, mournful cry that echoed through the river valley. It was answered by another, from a different direction, then another. My blood ran cold. There were more of them. As luck or maybe misfortune would have it, a party of white men from a settlement downriver had heard the gunfire and were out looking for us. They came riding into our camp just after first light, a dozen men on horses with a pack of good hunting dogs. They saw the creature on the ground and their faces went pale. We told them what happened, our words tumbling out fast and frantic. We told them about the calls. They didn't hesitate. They were as scared and determined as we were. We formed a new party, us 7 on foot, them on horseback, and we turned the dogs loose. The dogs caught the scent immediately. It was the same musky, wild smell from the dead creature. They bayed and took off, heading west towards the river. We followed, running, our exhaustion forgotten, fueled by a fresh, sharp terror. The dogs led us on a frantic chase through the thickets and down a steep bank to the Tugelo River. The river was wide there, maybe 60, 70 yards across, running fast and high with spring melt. And that's where we saw the second one. It was standing on the far bank, looking back at us. It was the same height, the same shaggy hair, the same posture. It watched us for a moment, and then it turned to face the river. The dogs, a good 8 or 10 of them, big, brave hounds, swam across and surged up the far bank, surrounding it, barking and snapping. The creature didn't run. It just stood its ground. Then it moved. It was so fast it was a blur. It swung its long arms, those powerful arms with the great claws, and it whipped the dogs. It didn't just swat them away, it whipped them. I heard yelps of pain and terror, and dogs went flying through the air, tumbling into the brush. It cleared a space around itself in seconds. Then it turned back to the river. It took a running start, a couple of giant, ground-eating strides, and it leaped. It jumped from the bank and sailed through the air, an impossible distance, landing on a sandbar in the middle of the river. It didn't even pause. It coiled its legs and jumped again, in one fluid motion, clearing the rest of the river and landing on our side, maybe 40 yards downstream from us. It stood there, water streaming from its hair, and it looked at us. It looked at the party of men on horseback, at us with our rifles, and for a single, heart-stopping second, our eyes met. There was no fear in its look. There was a cold, ancient anger. A promise. That's when one of the men on horseback, a fellow named Jennings, raised his rifle. He was a crack shot. He fired from the saddle. The ball took the creature high in the chest. It staggered, let out that same choked, guttural cry, and then it collapsed onto the riverbank, half in the water. We all rushed over. It was dead, just like the first one. We stood there, panting, soaked with sweat and river spray, staring at this second monster. The two of them were dead. We had killed them both. The immediate terror was over, but that feeling didn't last. It was replaced by something else, something deeper and colder. A profound, unsettling wrongness. We had just killed two things that shouldn't exist. We had looked into eyes that held a knowledge of these woods that was older than our settlements, older than our rifles, maybe older than man itself. We had heard their calls in the night, and we knew they weren't alone. We buried them there, in two unmarked graves by the river, and we never spoke of it much after. What was there to say? We went back to our lives, to hunting deer and turkey, to building our homes. But the woods never felt the same after that. The deep shadows between the trees held a different kind of silence. Sometimes, on a still night, when the wind is just right, I think I can still hear that hallowing sound, that deep, mournful call coming from across the river, and I know in my bones that we didn't kill all of them. We just learned that the world is a lot bigger and a lot stranger than we ever thought, and that some secrets are better left buried in the deep, dark woods. I still don't know what they were. I don't think I ever will. I just know what I saw, and I know I'll never forget it, not until the day I die. Story 6. This was back in the fall of 1983. I was a college student in Indiana, living in this weird old A-frame house tucked right up against the Morgan Monroe State Forest. The place was a bit of a dump, but it was cheap, and it had a deck that looked out into the woods, which I thought was cool at the time. It was October, I think, because the leaves were all turning, and there was that crisp smell in the air, the one that means winter isn't far off. That night, we'd had a bunch of people over. Just a party, you know, the usual. Music, cheap beer, people laughing. Nothing crazy. I remember the moon was full, one of those huge, bright ones that makes everything look like a black and white photo. You could see pretty well even without any lights on. The party had started to wind down, and most people had left or passed out in the living room. The air inside was thick with smoke and that stale beer smell. So I decided to step out onto the deck to get some fresh air and clear my head. I was just standing there, leaning on the railing, looking out at the woods. It was quiet, the kind of deep quiet you only get way out in the country. All the bugs had died off already, so there was just the sound of my own breathing and the occasional rustle of leaves from the breeze. The trees were these big, dark shapes, and the moonlight was cutting through the branches, making weird patterns on the ground. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a hiker. I remember thinking, who the hell is out walking in the woods at this time of night? It was moving along one of the trails that snaked through the trees, heading in the general direction of the house. I squinted, trying to get a better look. The shape was dark, silhouetted against the lighter patches of the forest floor where the moon hit. But then, as it got closer, the shape of it started to feel wrong. It was big. Not just tall, but enormous. The proportions were all off. I kept trying to make my brain see a person, but it wasn't working. It was built like a linebacker, but bigger than any man I'd ever seen. Its shoulders were impossibly wide, and it had no neck. Its head just sat right on top of those massive shoulders, like a boulder balanced on a cliff. The way it moved was what really got to me, though. It wasn't a walk. It was a lope, a kind of heavy rolling gait, that looked both powerful and clumsy at the same time. Its arms were long, swinging at its sides, and the whole motion was just unnatural. It didn't move like anything should move. It was smooth but heavy, like it weighed a ton, but wasn't bothered by it at all. A cold feeling started in my gut, a tight knot of pure dread. This wasn't a hiker. This wasn't a bear. I'd seen bears. This was something else. It was getting closer, maybe 100 yards out now, and it was still coming right for the house. It wasn't veering off the trail. It was coming straight at me. My heart started hammering against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands, which were resting on the wooden deck railing, started to feel cold and numb. The earlier buzz from the beer evaporated instantly, replaced by a sharp, sobering fear. I couldn't move. I was just frozen, watching this thing get closer and closer. I could hear the soft, heavy thuds of its footsteps now, a sound that was too solid, too weighty for a person. Then its head turned. I couldn't see any features, just a dark, round shape, but I knew it was looking right at me. It stopped for a second, and the woods went completely silent, like everything was holding its breath. That's when I broke. I stumbled backwards, my legs feeling like jelly. I fumbled with the sliding glass door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get a grip. I finally yanked it open and fell back inside, slamming it shut and fumbling for the lock. The click of the little latch sounded pathetically small. My friends were scattered around the living room. 2 were asleep on the couches, and my roommate Mark was half awake in a chair. "What's your problem?" Mark mumbled, his words slurred. I couldn't get my breath. I was panting. "There's something out there," I managed to choke out. My voice was a high, tight whisper. "We need to get in the bedroom, now." They must have seen the sheer terror on my face because nobody argued. Mark shook the other 2 awake, and we all scrambled down the short hall to the main bedroom at the back of the house. It was the only room without a big window facing the woods. As we piled in, I told them to lock the door. The fear in the room was contagious now, a thick, silent tension. Nobody was asking questions. My mind was racing. My dad was a gun guy, and he'd left an old, legally owned machine gun with me for home defense, which I'd always thought was overkill. It was a World War II-era thing, a M3 grease gun, and it was stored in a case under my bed in this very room. It felt stupid and dramatic, but in that moment, it was the only thing I could think of. I got the case out. My hands were still shaking, making it hard to work the latches. The cold, heavy metal of the gun felt foreign and terrifying in my hands. I loaded a magazine, the clicks echoing in the quiet room. I don't know what I was thinking. I wasn't thinking. I was just operating on pure animal instinct. "What are you doing?" Mark hissed. "I'm going to look," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Lock the door behind me." I cracked the bedroom door open. The hallway was dark and silent. I crept out, the gun feeling both ridiculously heavy and like my only lifeline. I moved through the living room, which was still littered with empty cups and ashtrays. The sliding glass door to the deck was a black rectangle. I couldn't see anything through it. I decided to go out the back door, the one that led from the kitchen to a small, grassy area and the woodpile. Maybe I could get a different angle, see if it was still out there. My heart was a drum in my ears. Every creak of the floorboards under my feet sounded like a gunshot. I unlocked the back door and slowly pushed it open, stepping out into the cold night air. The moon was so bright it cast sharp shadows from the woodpile and the trees at the edge of the clearing. I stood there for a second, the gun held tight against my shoulder, scanning the tree line, and then I saw it. It was standing maybe 30 feet away, just at the edge where the grass met the trees. It was even bigger up close. It had to be 8 feet tall, easy. It was just standing there, completely still, facing me. It was covered in dark hair, but in the moonlight, it looked almost black and slick, like wet fur. I still couldn't make out a face, just a dark patch where a face should be. We stood there frozen for what felt like an hour, but was probably only a few seconds. I could feel its attention on me, a physical pressure. It didn't make a sound. It didn't growl or roar. The silence was worse than any sound could have been. Then it took a step forward. It wasn't a threatening step, not really. It was just a step. But it was a step toward me, and in that moment, every single nerve in my body screamed that I was prey. The fear was so complete, so overwhelming, that my brain just short-circuited. I didn't think about what it was. I didn't think about the consequences. I just reacted. I squeezed the trigger. The sound was deafening, an ear-splitting brap that shattered the night's silence. The gun bucked in my hands, the muzzle flashing, illuminating the thing for a split second. I saw it jolt, a massive dark shape recoiling. I kept firing, spraying bullets into the trees where it had been standing, the smell of gunpowder and hot metal filling my nostrils. The burst only lasted a couple of seconds before the gun clicked empty. My ears were ringing, and in the sudden quiet, I heard a tremendous crashing sound from the woods, like a bulldozer was plowing through the undergrowth. It was moving fast, breaking branches, the sound getting fainter as it fled deeper into the forest. I stood there, panting, the hot gun smoking in my hands, the acrid smell stuck in the back of my throat. I was trembling all over, my muscles quivering with adrenaline. Then the back door flew open. Mark and the others were there, their faces pale and wide-eyed. "What the hell was that?" one of them yelled, his voice muffled by the ringing in my ears. "We saw it," Mark said, his voice shaking. "From the window. Something big, something huge, just ran past the side of the house. It was so fast." We didn't sleep the rest of the night. We stayed huddled in the living room with all the lights on, not talking much, just listening to every little sound from outside. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind made us jump. The fear was a living thing in the room with us. We were all just waiting for the sun to come up. When the first grey light of dawn finally started to filter through the trees, it felt like a reprieve. As soon as it was light enough to see, I went outside. My legs were still weak. Mark came with me, but he stayed on the deck while I walked toward the tree line. The grass was all torn up and flattened where the thing had been standing. It looked like someone had driven a car over the spot, and leading away from it, into the woods, was a trail of destruction. Saplings were snapped in half, bushes were crushed, and there were deep gouges in the forest floor. I followed the trail. It wasn't hard. It looked like a tornado had cut a narrow path through the woods. The trail led up a small ridge, a vantage point that looked directly down onto my house. And that's where I found them. Footprints. They were enormous. I'm not talking about big footprints. I'm talking about things that looked like they were made by a giant. I knelt down next to one. I placed my own boot next to it for scale. My boot was a size 10, and it looked like a child's toy. These prints had to be at least 20 inches long. They were deep, pressed into the soft earth with immense weight. They had a clear shape like a giant human foot, but wider, with the toes splayed out. I looked around, my skin crawling. There was no body, no blood, nothing. Just these impossible footprints and the wrecked path it had made as it fled. It had stood right here on this ridge, looking down at my house, after I'd shot at it, after it should have been dead. I lived in that A-frame for the rest of the school year. I had nowhere else to go, but I was never the same. I never went out on the deck at night again. I kept all the curtains closed after dark. Every time I looked out at that trail, my stomach would clench. I was always watching, always waiting, haunted by the possibility that it was still out there, that it remembered, and that it might come back. I never saw it again. But I know what I saw. And I know what left those prints, and to this day, the memory of that shape in the moonlight and the sound of it crashing away through the trees is enough to make my blood run cold. I don't have an explanation. I just have the memory and the fear that never really went away. Story 7. We drove up early that day, left around 6 in the morning from our place in Asheville. The drive was nice. Cool autumn air, leaves starting to turn, but in the mountains it was already pretty crisp. We got to the forest by mid-morning, found a campsite we liked, one that was a bit off the main trail, surrounded by tall pines and oaks. It felt secluded, which we usually love because it's just us and nature. We set up the tent in a small clearing, and I decided to sleep in my hammock behind the site, maybe 20 feet away from the tent. I've always liked sleeping outside, feeling the breeze, hearing the night sounds. My wife preferred the tent, said it felt safer, and the dogs usually slept with her. That day, we spent hiking with the dogs, cooked dinner over the fire, hot dogs and beans, nothing fancy, and just enjoyed the quiet. As it got dark, we sat by the fire for a bit, but it was cold, so we turned in early, maybe around 9:30. I got into my hammock, bundled up in my sleeping bag. The hammock was one of those camping ones with a bug net strung between two sturdy pines. I remember the stars were out, but it was cloudy in patches, so it wasn't super bright. The forest was alive with sounds, crickets, the occasional owl, leaves rustling, normal stuff. I fell asleep pretty quickly, tired from the hike. The dogs were in the tent with my wife and everything felt peaceful. Then I woke up. I don't know what time it was exactly, but later I figured it was around 2:30 in the morning. Something had jolted me awake. At first I thought it was just the cold. The temperature had dropped and I could see my breath in little puffs. But then I heard it, a sharp snap, like a branch breaking close by, not a small twig, but something thicker, like a limb. I lay there listening, my heart starting to pick up a bit. I'm not usually jumpy in the woods. I've camped my whole life. But this felt different. The snap was followed by another, and then a deep, powerful noise. It sounded like a deer snort, you know, that huffing sound they make, but lower, much lower, like it was coming from something bigger. And it wasn't just one sound, it was part of a rhythm. There were these snaps, then whooshes, like something heavy moving through the underbrush, and it had a pattern to it. Snap, whoosh, over and over. It was unsettling because it didn't sound random. It felt intentional, like a beat. I stayed still, trying to peer into the darkness. My hammock was facing away from the tent, toward the deeper woods, so I couldn't see much. The moon was behind clouds, so it was pitch black except for little slivers of light. The sounds kept going, maybe 30 feet away, and I could feel the vibrations in the ground, subtle, but there. My skin prickled, and I started to sweat, despite the cold. I remember thinking it might be a bear. We have black bears in North Carolina, and they can make noise, but this didn't sound like any bear I'd ever heard. Bears are usually clumsier, more random in their movements. This was rhythmic, almost deliberate, and that snort, it was so deep it felt like it was vibrating in my chest. After a few minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to check on my wife and the dogs. Slowly, I unzipped the hammock bug net and climbed out. My legs were shaky and I felt exposed. As soon as my feet hit the ground, the sounds stopped. Just like that. Complete silence. No snaps, no whooshes, nothing. Even the crickets had gone quiet. It was eerie, like the forest was holding its breath. I stood there for a second listening, but all I heard was my own breathing, too loud in the stillness. I crept over to the tent, which was just a dark shape in the gloom. I could hear the dogs shifting inside, but they weren't barking or growling, which was weird. Usually if there's something out there, they'd be going nuts. But they were quiet, almost too quiet. I whispered my wife's name, and she stirred. I told her I heard something, and she said she'd been awake, heard it too, but thought it was just the wind. I didn't want to scare her, so I said I was going back to the hammock to keep an eye out. She mumbled okay, and I headed back. The whole time, the silence pressed in on me. It felt heavy, unnatural. As I got back to the hammock and started to climb in, the sound started up again, not gradually, but right away. Snap, whoosh, and that deep snort. My heart hammered against my ribs, and I froze. This time, it felt closer, maybe 20 feet away. I could almost sense movement in the darkness, something big shifting weight. That's when I got the idea to use my headlamp. I always keep it handy when camping. I fumbled for it, my hands trembling, and clicked it on. The beam cut through the black, sweeping across the trees and undergrowth, and instantly the sounds stopped again. Dead silence. I swung the light around, but I didn't see anything. No eyes reflecting back, no movement, just trees and shadows. I kept the light on for what felt like forever, scanning slowly. Nothing. After a couple of minutes, I started to feel a little foolish. Maybe it was just an animal, and the light scared it off. I decided to turn the headlamp off to save battery, thinking if it was gone, it was gone. The second I clicked it off, the sounds resumed, snap, whoosh, even louder now, and that snort was deeper, more aggressive. It was like whatever it was had been waiting, watching me. That thought sent a cold shiver down my spine. I turned the headlamp back on, and again, silence, off, and the sounds came back. On, silence, off sounds. I did this a few times, and each time it reacted immediately. It wasn't random, it was intelligent. It knew what the light meant. That's when real fear set in, not just nervousness, but gut-wrenching, paralyzing fear. My mouth went dry, and I could feel my palms slick with sweat. This wasn't an animal. It was something that understood cause and effect, something that was playing with me. I don't know how long I stood there, switching the light on and off, but eventually I couldn't take it anymore. I felt like I was being toyed with, like I was in some kind of game I didn't understand. The sounds were getting closer, and I could hear heavy footsteps now, thudding softly on the forest floor. Whatever it was big. I thought about the dogs, my wife, and I knew I had to get to the tent. I left the headlamp on, pointing it toward the sounds, and backed away slowly toward the tent. My legs felt like jelly, and every step was an effort. I kept expecting something to rush out of the darkness, but nothing did. When I reached the tent, I unzipped it as quietly as I could and slipped inside. My wife was sitting up, her eyes wide. She'd heard it all. The dogs were huddled close to her, whining softly. I told her we needed to stay quiet, that something was out there. She nodded, her face pale in the dim light from my headlamp, which I'd turned off once I was inside. We sat there listening. For a few minutes it was quiet, and I started to hope it had left, but then the sounds started again. This time, right outside the tent, snap, whoosh, and that snort was so close I could feel the air vibrate. The tent fabric rustled slightly, like something was brushing against it. The dogs started to growl low in their throats, but they didn't bark, which was strange. Almost like they were too scared to make noise. We held each other, not saying a word. I could feel my wife trembling, and I was shaking too. The sounds circled the tent, slow and deliberate. I remember thinking, this is it. We're going to die out here, and no one will ever know what happened. Then, suddenly, everything stopped. The silence was absolute, heavier than before. We waited, barely breathing, and that's when we heard it, one final violent crack. It wasn't like the earlier snaps. This was loud, explosive, like a thick log splitting in half. It echoed through the forest, bouncing off the trees, and for a second, I thought it was right on top of us. The sound was so intense, it felt like it punched through me, and I flinched, pulling my wife closer. After that, nothing. No more sounds, no movement, just silence. We stayed in the tent, too terrified to move, until the sky started to lighten with dawn. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a couple. As soon as it was bright enough to see, we slowly unzipped the tent and peered out. The forest looked normal. Trees, leaves, our camp setup, but the air felt different, charged. We got out, the dogs following cautiously, and we searched the area. I went straight to where I'd heard the sounds, near my hammock. Nothing. No broken branches, no footprints, no sign of anything. It was like it never happened, but I knew it did. That crack, it had been real, and it left a mark on me that's still there. We packed up quickly and left, didn't even bother with breakfast. The drive home was quiet, both of us lost in our thoughts. We've camped since then, but never in that forest and never the same way. I still sleep in a hammock sometimes, but I'm always on edge, listening for sounds that don't belong. That experience changed how I see the woods. It's not just nature anymore, it's something else, something aware. I don't know what it was, Bigfoot, some unknown animal or something else, but I know we weren't welcome there that night. And that final crack, it wasn't just a sound, it was a warning. To this day, I can't explain it, and I doubt I ever will. Story 8. The drive from Shelton to my place usually takes about 45 minutes, most of it on these winding back roads that cut through thick forest. I know the route like the back of my hand. I've driven it 1,000 times, day and night. But that night, it felt different. There was no moon to speak of, and the usual handful of other headlights was completely absent. It was just me. The dull yellow glow of my own headlights and a tunnel of blackness punched through the towering evergreens on either side of the road. My radio was on, but it was all static. I'd lost the station from Shelton about 10 minutes in, and I hadn't bothered to find a new one. I was just driving, one hand on the wheel, the other arm resting on the window frame, feeling the cool, damp air. My mind was wandering, thinking about nothing in particular. Work the next day, the stupid argument I'd had with my girlfriend that morning, just the usual background noise of life. I was tired, my eyes were a little heavy, and I remember thinking I should have just crashed on my friend's couch. The road curved to the left, one of those gentle, sweeping bends you don't even think about. I took it at a comfortable speed, my headlights sweeping across the asphalt, and then, as the turn progressed, they dipped into the deep ditch that ran along the right-hand side of the road, and that's when I saw it. My brain didn't process it as a monster, not at first. It registered as a person, a big guy maybe, crouched down in the ditch, like he was tying his shoe or looking for something he'd dropped. It was a split-second image, the kind you see and dismiss. But my foot instinctively lifted off the gas a little. Something was wrong with that picture. As my car finished the turn and the headlights fully illuminated the ditch, the person shape resolved into something else entirely. It was huge. I don't mean tall athlete huge. I mean impossibly unnaturally massive. It was crouched on its haunches, with one of its arms, I guess you'd call it an arm, planted on the ground for support like a gorilla. Its shoulders were unbelievably broad, just slabs of muscle and darkness that seemed to merge directly with its head. There was no neck. Its head just sat right on top of those monstrous shoulders, and it was covered in hair. Fur, whatever you call it. It wasn't like a bear's fur, which can look shaggy or matted. This was different. It was a dark, wet-looking brown, almost black, and where my headlights hit it, it shone like it was oily or wet with dew. The sheer bulk of it is what stuck with me. It wasn't just tall, it was dense, heavy, built like a piece of earth itself had decided to stand up. It was the movement that froze the blood in my veins. It turned its head. It wasn't a quick, startled jerk. It was a slow, deliberate pivot of that massive head towards the source of the light, towards me, and as it turned, its eyes caught the light. They didn't glow white, like a deer's. They were a dull, rusty orange color, like old embers in a dead fire. There was no life in them, no curiosity, no fear, just this flat, ancient sort of observation. It was looking right at me through my windshield, and in that moment I felt more seen, more completely known than I ever have in my life. It was a feeling of being stripped bare, of being assessed by something that operated on a completely different set of rules. My heart wasn't just pounding. It felt like it was trying to tear its way out of my chest. A cold sweat instantly broke out all over my body, a clammy, sick feeling that had nothing to do with the temperature. My hands were locked on the wheel, my knuckles white. I'd slowed the car to a crawl without even realizing it, my brain screaming at me to go, while my body was locked in this terrified paralysis. As I drew almost level with it, the headlights gave me a perfect, horrifying view of its face. It was human-like, but all wrong. It was like someone had taken a human face and built it out of clay, then pressed it down and added weight. The nose was broad and flat, squashed against its face. Above it was a massive bony brow ridge that shadowed those orange eyes, making them look like they were sunk deep in caves. I didn't see a mouth. The lower part of its face was just a dark shadow, but the upper part, with that heavy brow and those dead eyes, was burned into my mind. It wasn't a monster mask. It was a face, a real, living, breathing face on a thing that had no business existing. I couldn't stop. Stopping wasn't even an option. The thought of my car coming to a halt a few feet from that thing, of the engine dying, of being left in the silence with it, no, absolutely not. My foot, which had been hovering over the brake, stomped down on the gas instead. The Ranger's engine, which is usually pretty anemic, roared. The tires chirped on the pavement as I accelerated away. My eyes were glued to the rearview mirror, my breath caught in my throat. The ditch was receding behind me, a pool of darkness again. For a second, I thought I'd just see the dark shape, still crouched, but I didn't. As I watched, the shape moved, it uncoiled, it rose. It didn't stand up like a man. It was a powerful fluid uncurling, a release of pent-up energy. It went from that low, crouching posture to its full height in one terrifyingly smooth motion, and its full height. God. It towered over the ditch. The ditch was easily 5-6 feet deep, and this thing stood so that its head and shoulders were well above the road level. It had to be 8 feet tall, maybe more. It was just this colossal black silhouette against the slightly less black forest behind it. It was standing there facing the road, facing the direction I'd gone, just standing, watching me flee. That was the most vulnerable I have ever felt in my entire life. In that moment, in my little metal and glass box, speeding away at 50 then 60 miles an hour, I felt completely and utterly exposed. I felt like a rabbit that had just bolted from a fox, and the fox was just watching it run, knowing it could catch it whenever it wanted. The sheer size of it, the implicit power in that simple act of standing up. It communicated a dominance over that landscape, over me that was absolute. I tore my eyes from the mirror and focused on the road, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it hurt. I pushed the truck faster, taking curves too quickly, the tires squealing in protest. I didn't care. I just had to get out of there, put as much distance between me and that thing as possible. I kept checking the mirror, expecting to see it loping after me on the road, covering the distance with those long, powerful strides I could just imagine it having. But the road behind me remained empty, just a ribbon of asphalt swallowed by the night. The rest of the drive is a blur of panic and tunnel vision. I don't remember passing any landmarks. I just remember the feeling of the gas pedal under my foot, the white-knuckle grip on the steering wheel, and the constant, frantic checks in the rearview mirror. Every shadow at the edge of my headlights made me jump. Every overhanging branch looked like a reaching arm. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I didn't even turn the engine off right away. I just sat there, shaking. My whole body was trembling. My teeth were practically chattering. I looked around my quiet suburban street, at the familiar houses with their porch lights, and it felt like I'd landed on another planet. The normalcy of it all was jarring, almost offensive. I killed the engine and practically fell out of the truck. My legs were weak, like jelly. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the lock. I burst through my front door, slammed it shut behind me, and threw the deadbolt. I stood there in my dark hallway, my back pressed against the door, listening for footsteps, for breathing, for anything. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my couch in the dark, every light in the house off, and just stared out the window at the street. Every car that passed, every rustle of leaves from the tree in my front yard sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through me. I was a 35-year-old man sitting in his own home, terrified of the dark. I kept replaying it in my head, the way the light hit the oily fur, the slow turn of its head, those flat orange eyes, the sheer impossible scale of it as it stood up. I'd always laughed at the Bigfoot stories, thought they were campfire tales for gullible people. I wasn't a believer. I was a skeptic. I needed proof. Well, I got my proof, and I wish to God I hadn't. It's been 6 months now. I still think about it every single day. I don't drive that road anymore. I take the highway, which adds 20 minutes to my trip. I can't even look at the woods the same way. I used to love hiking, camping. Now, the deep woods just feel occupied, watched. I saw something that night on that road near Shelton. I don't know what to call it. Sasquatch, Bigfoot. The name doesn't matter. What matters is that it was real. It was flesh and blood and fur, and it was so much bigger and more powerful than I could have ever imagined. It wasn't a ghost or an alien. It was an animal, a predator maybe, or just something that lives in those deep, dark places and doesn't want to be found. I saw it, and it saw me, and sometimes in the dead of night, I can still feel the weight of that thing's gaze on me. And I wonder if it remembers me too. See te futasus toton. Story 9. It was the 3rd week of November, gun deer season in Marinette County, and the cold had already sunk its teeth deep into the land. I'm Shannon Morgan. I've been hunting these woods my whole life, and my family's been on this same 80-acre piece for generations. It's mostly cedar swamp, thick and dark even on a good day. The kind of place where sound gets swallowed up and the light struggles to reach the ground. This particular morning, my cousin and I were headed out to our stands. It was that pitch-black time, an hour before sunrise, when the world feels dead and silent. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, and every step we took crunched a little on the frozen crust of the mud. We were using red lens headlamps to preserve our night vision, just following the familiar path we'd made over the years. I'd been feeling weird about this spot for a couple of weeks, since I'd done my pre-season scouting. Normally, the swamp is teeming with life. You see deer sign everywhere, rubs, scrapes, tracks. You hear squirrels, see birds, but the center of this swamp, this year, was just dead. It was like someone had drawn a line. Outside the line, normal woods. Inside, nothing. And the tracks I found, Jesus, they were huge, not a bear's. A bear track is messy, with claws. These were big, uniform, almost human-looking, but way too big. They were pressed deep into the wet mud near the creek, and they just walked in a straight line, like whatever made them didn't have a care in the world. I tried to tell myself it was a freak thing, maybe a moose that wandered way out of its territory, but I knew it wasn't. I just pushed it down. A hunter gets spooked by weird stuff sometimes. You learn to ignore it. So we're walking in, and we're about halfway to our stands, right where the cedars get really thick. When I first noticed it, a sound. It wasn't a branch snapping, it was a step. A soft, heavy crunch off to our left, maybe 30, 40 yards into the blackness. I stopped dead, and my cousin did too. We both stood there, not breathing, just listening. And then we heard it again. Crunch. It mirrored my own step, exactly. I took a hesitant step forward. A second later, from the same direction, another crunch. It was keeping pace with us. My heart started thumping in my ears, a loud, stupid rhythm. I clicked off my headlamp and nudged my cousin to do the same. Total darkness wrapped around us, cold and suffocating. That's when I smelled it. A faint odor, carried on a slight breeze. It was musky, thick, like wet dog and old rotted meat. It was a smell that felt dirty, like it coated the inside of your nose. I'd smelled a lot of things in the woods: skunk, dead things, fox musk. but nothing like this. This was different. This was heavy. We stood there for what felt like 10 minutes, just frozen, listening to this thing mirror our every move from the shadows. It never got closer, but it never fell behind. It was just there. A presence. My fingers were going numb around my rifle stock, and it wasn't just from the cold. It was a pure animal fear, the kind that empties your head of everything except the need to not be where you are. Then it stopped. The mirroring steps just ceased. The woods went silent again, that deep, waiting silence. I felt a tiny, stupid flicker of relief. Maybe it was just a coyote or a big buck being curious. Maybe it had moved on. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, a white cloud in the black air. That's when the scream happened. It wasn't a scream, I don't have a word for it. It erupted from directly ahead of us, right where our stands were, maybe 100 yards away. It started as a low, guttural roar that shook my ribs, and then it ripped upwards into this high-pitched, shrieking howl that was pure, undiluted hate. It was so loud, so violently loud that it didn't even feel like a sound. It felt like a physical blow. The hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood straight up, a primal reaction I'd never felt before. My scalp was crawling. My cousin made a small, choked sound next to me like a whimper. Instinct took over. I fumbled for my headlamp, my hands shaking so bad I could barely find the switch. I flipped it on, the white light stabbing into the darkness, and I swept it toward the sound, and I saw the eyes. They were about 70, 80 feet ahead, but they were high up, way too high. 7 feet, maybe 10 feet off the ground. The light hit them and they reflected back this dull, reddish-orange glow. They weren't close together like a deer's. They were set wide apart and they just stared, unblinking. They didn't move. They just hung there in the darkness, watching us. I have never moved so fast in my life. There was no discussion, no what do we do. We just ran, we turned, and we bolted back the way we came, crashing through brush, not caring about the noise. The fear was a chemical fire in my veins. I wasn't thinking about hunting or being quiet. I was thinking about getting the hell out of that swamp. I could hear my cousin right behind me, his breath coming in ragged sobs. We didn't get far, maybe 100 yards back down the trail. We both just dove. There was a big downed cedar log, and we scrambled behind it, pressing ourselves into the frozen leaf litter and mud. We were both panting, our breath pluming in the beam of my headlamp, which was now pointing at the ground, shaking with the tremors in my hand. I clicked it off. Darkness again. And then the smell came back. It washed over us, that same musky, rotten smell, but now it was stronger. So much stronger. It was thick enough to taste, a foul, coppery taste in the back of my throat. It was close. Whatever it was, it had followed us. It was right there on the other side of that log. I could hear it breathing, not panting like an animal. It was a slow, deep, rhythmic sound like a bellows. I could feel the vibration of its steps through the ground, a heavy, deliberate thump, thump. I clutched my rifle, my finger on the safety, but I was too scared to even peek over the log. What was I going to shoot at? A pair of eyes, a smell. My mind was screaming at me, a jumble of every scary story I'd ever heard about these woods, every weird track I'd ever seen. My whole body was rigid, locked in place by a terror so complete it was paralyzing. I just kept my head down, praying to a God I hadn't talked to in years, listening to that breathing and smelling that god-awful stench. My cousin had his face pressed into the dirt, and I could feel him shaking. We stayed like that for an eternity. It felt like hours. The sky began to lighten from absolute black to a deep, gloomy gray. The shapes of the trees started to separate from the darkness. As the world got quieter, the sounds of the thing seemed to fade. The breathing stopped, the heavy footsteps receded, the smell lingered, a ghost of the terror. But it slowly began to dissipate on the morning air. Finally, when the sun was just starting to color the horizon, I dared to lift my head. I looked over the log. Nothing. The trail was empty. The woods were still. It felt like a normal November morning again, but it wasn't. It could never be normal again. We didn't speak. We just got up, our clothes soaked and muddy, and started walking back toward the truck, our rifles held tight. We were maybe 50 yards from where we'd hidden when I saw it. A movement, way off in the thick deadfalls, the tangles of fallen trees that are impossible to walk through. It was just a dark patch, darker than the shadows, shifting between the trunks. It was big. It moved on 2 legs. I didn't see any details, no face, no form, just a mass of something dark and hairy, moving with a purpose through a place nothing should have been able to move. It was there for a second, and then it was gone, swallowed by the swamp. We got to the truck in a daze. We didn't even put our guns in the cases. We just threw them in the back and got in. We sat there for a minute, the engine running, heater blasting, and just looked at each other. His face was white as a sheet. I'm sure mine was too. We were too shaken to just leave. We felt like we had to know, had to find some kind of proof that we weren't going completely insane. So after we'd calmed down a little, we got out and decided to check the old wagon trail that cuts through the property. It's an old, overgrown 2-track, usually just mud and weeds. That's where we found the tracks, the same ones I'd seen scouting. Huge, human-like footprints sunk deep into the soft earth of the trail. They were fresh, and right next to them, we found the other thing, the feces. It was massive, way bigger than any bear scat I'd ever seen, and it looked wrong. It had hair and bits of bone in it, which isn't that unusual for a predator, but the shape, the composition, it looked almost human. It was a disgusting, unsettling thing to see, just sitting there in the middle of the trail. We left after that. We didn't go back to our stands. We just went home. The story doesn't even end there. A few days later, another one of my cousins was hunting in a different part of the same 80 acres, in a ground blind. He told us later that something big and bipedal covered in dark hair just walked right out of the cedars and started coming towards his blind. It was making these low, guttural grunts. He said it got so close he could smell it, that same musky smell, and he was so terrified he shouldered his rifle and aimed right at it. The second the scope was on it, it stopped, let out this huff of air, and then just turned and melted back into the trees. He packed up and left right then. We avoided the center of that swamp for the rest of the season. The deer activity, which was already weird, just plummeted to nothing. It was like the whole area had been cleaned out. That was 7 years ago. I haven't been back to that part of the property since. I still hunt the edges, but I won't go into the heart of that cedar swamp. Every time I even think about it, I can feel that cold fear creeping back in. I can hear that scream in my head, a sound that doesn't belong in this world. I can smell that rotten musk. I can see those red-orange eyes just hanging in the darkness, watching. I'm a grown man, a lifelong hunter, and I'm too scared to go back to a piece of land my own family owns. I don't know what was in there with us that morning. I don't have a name for it. I just know it was real, and it was terrible, and it knew we were there. Story 10. It all started because I had a weird experience a couple years back in the same area. Just a quick glimpse of something big and hairy moving through the trees, but it was enough to make me wonder. So this year, I decided to go back with 5 friends from church. We're not like hardcore investigators or anything. We're just regular people who thought it'd be fun to check it out. I didn't want to go alone, and they were curious. So we planned it for the 5th of July. We figured it'd be a good day off, maybe have a picnic or something. But it turned into nothing like that. We met up early that morning, around 8 o'clock. The sky was clear, and it was already warming up. The kind of day that makes you feel optimistic. We drove out to this spot in Washington, deep in the woods near an old logging road I remembered from before. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. and the sunlight was filtering through the trees in that way that makes everything feel peaceful. I was excited, honestly. I kept telling myself it was just a hike, but part of me hoped we'd see something, you know, like maybe I wasn't crazy the first time. We parked the car off the main road and started hiking in. The trail was overgrown in places, with ferns brushing against our legs and mosquitoes buzzing around. I remember one of my friends complaining about the bugs, and we all laughed it off. We walked for what felt like a couple hours, just chatting and enjoying the scenery. The woods were thick, with tall cedars and firs blocking out a lot of the sun. So even though it was daytime, it felt dim and kind of closed in. I pointed out where I'd seen that thing before, a clearing near a creek. But there was nothing there now, just some broken branches and animal tracks. By afternoon, we'd eaten the snacks we brought and were just hanging out feeling a bit let down. I suggested we try tree knocks. I'd read online that sometimes, if you knock on trees, you might get a response from whatever's out there. It sounded silly when I said it out loud, but my friends were game. So I found a solid-looking tree and gave it a couple good knocks with a stick. The sound echoed a little, but otherwise it was quiet. We waited, listening. The forest felt still, like it was holding its breath. Then, after maybe 30 seconds, we heard it. A low, deep knock from somewhere off to our left. It wasn't like a branch falling or an animal. It was too deliberate, too solid. My heart skipped a beat. We all froze, and I could feel the hair on my arms standing up. One of my friends whispered, "Did you hear that?" And we just nodded, not wanting to make noise. We strained our ears, and that's when we saw the eyes. In the shadows between the trees, about 50 yards away, there were two sets of eyes glowing. One was this weird silver-blue color like ice, and the other was orange. But the orange ones were way too close together, almost like they belonged to something with a narrow face. They weren't moving, just staring right at us. I felt a chill run down my spine, and my stomach tightened. This wasn't like seeing a deer or a bear. This felt intelligent, like we were being studied. The air got colder, or maybe it was just me, but I started shivering even though it was still warm out. My friends were freaking out quietly. One of them nudged me and said, "Try whooping or something, like they do in those videos." I didn't want to, but curiosity was overriding the fear at that point. So I took a deep breath and let out a whoop. It was shaky and not very loud, but it echoed in the quiet. We waited, and I swear, it felt like forever. Then, about 15 seconds later, we heard this guttural sound like a growl mixed with a grunt, and right after, a whoop that sounded almost exactly like mine, but deeper and more menacing. It came from the same direction as the eyes. That's when the fear really set in. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was pure, gut-wrenching terror. We all huddled closer together, and I could feel my hands trembling. We started noticing more sets of those silver-blue eyes appearing in the darkness around us. They weren't moving fast, just slowly shifting, like whatever they belonged to was circling us. The orange eyes were still there, unmoving, and I got this overwhelming sense that we were being watched by multiple things. The woods, which had felt peaceful earlier, now felt hostile, like we'd trespassed into someone's home. We decided we needed to get out of there, but we didn't want to run and attract more attention. One of my friends suggested moving to a nearby quarry we'd passed on the way in. It was more open, so we might see better and feel less trapped. We started walking slowly, keeping our flashlights off to avoid drawing more eyes. Every step felt like it took forever. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, and the rustling of leaves under our feet sounded way too loud. The eyes followed us, keeping their distance but always there, those glowing dots in the dark. By the time we reached the quarry, the sun had set, and it was getting properly dark. The quarry was this wide, rocky area with tall grass around the edges, and the moon was out, giving everything a pale, eerie glow. We pulled out the night vision goggles I'd brought, just a cheap pair but better than nothing. I put them on, and the world turned green and grainy. At first I didn't see anything, just rocks and grass swaying in the breeze. Then movement caught my eye. About 30 yards away, in the grass, there was something walking. It was shorter than I expected, maybe 6 or 7 feet tall, and it moved in a crouched, almost shuffling way. It wasn't like a bear. Bears don't walk upright like that. This thing had broad shoulders and seemed bulky, but it moved quietly, like it was trying not to be seen. I held my breath and focused the goggles on it. That's when it stopped and turned its head toward us. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I felt like it was looking right at me through the goggles. Then it crouched down low, like it was hiding, and I got this intense feeling that it knew we were watching. A second later, a rock landed about 10 feet away from us with a thud. It wasn't thrown hard, but it was deliberate, like a warning. We all jumped, and one of my friends let out a small yelp. I ripped off the goggles, and in the moonlight, I could just make out the shape of the thing still crouched in the grass. My blood ran cold. We didn't say anything. We just started backing away slowly, not turning our backs on it. Every muscle in my body was tense, and I could feel the adrenaline making my legs weak. We kept moving step by step until we were out of the quarry and back on the trail. The walk back to the car was the longest of my life. We didn't talk, just listened for any sounds behind us. I kept expecting to hear footsteps or more rocks, but it was quiet, too quiet. The eyes were gone. But that feeling of being watched stayed with us the whole way. When we finally reached the car, we piled in quickly, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so bad I could barely get them in the ignition. We drove off without looking back, and no one spoke for the first 10 minutes. Then we all started talking at once, trying to make sense of it, but we couldn't. We just knew we'd seen something, and it wasn't human. Since then, I haven't been able to shake it. I keep thinking about those eyes, especially the orange ones so close together, and that guttural sound. I don't know what it was, but it felt ancient and powerful, like we'd stumbled into something we shouldn't have. My friends won't go back into the woods with me, and I don't blame them. Part of me wants to return to understand, but the fear is too real. Whatever it was, it let us go with that warning. And I'm not pushing my luck. I just can't explain it. And I doubt I ever will. Story 11. My name's Charles Stover. Back in 1952, I was a bakery truck driver for Dutch oven bakeries. It was a good job, honest work. I'd get up before the sun, load up the truck with bread and pastries, and drive my route through the counties. I knew those roads like the back of my hand, every pothole, every leaning tree, every farmhouse light that stayed on all night. I liked the quiet of the early mornings, the way the world felt like it was just mine for a few hours. But this one night, it was different. This was late, just before 11 at night. I'd had a long day, a delayed delivery over in Webster County, and I was finally on my way back home. I was tired, bone tired, the kind of tired that makes your eyes feel gritty and your shoulders ache. But I was sober. I feel like I have to say that. I wasn't a drinking man. Not then. Not ever, really. My wife will tell you that, Miss Stover. She's always been clear on that point. The truck was an old thing, smelled always of yeast and warm bread, even when it was empty. The heater whined and only blew lukewarm air. And that night, I remember my knuckles were white on the steering wheel because it was so cold. The road I was on was a backwards cut-through between Braxton and Webster counties, near Hickory Flats. It wasn't a road you took for the scenery. You took it because it shaved 20 minutes off the trip. It was narrow, barely 2 lanes, with woods pressing in on both sides so thick it felt like driving through a tunnel. No streetlights, of course, just my headlights cutting 2 shaky cones through the absolute blackness. The moon was out, a thin, cold sliver that didn't do much except make the shadows look deeper. I was rounding a curve, a long, lazy one that followed a creek bed. I was probably going a little too fast, just wanting to get home, to get into my own bed. My mind was on the next day's route, on the sound of the engine, on the chill in the cab, and then I saw it. It was on the edge of the road, right where the gravel shoulder dropped off into the ditch. For a split second, my brain didn't know what it was looking at. It was just a shape, a dark, tall shape where there shouldn't be one. A bear, I thought, a big one, standing on its hind legs. But it was wrong. It was too upright, and then my headlights caught it full on. It was standing there, erect, like a man, but it wasn't a man. It was covered, and I mean covered in hair, thick, matted, dark hair from its face all the way down its body. It must have been 6 feet tall, maybe a little more. It was just standing there, stock still, and it was glaring right at me, right into the headlights, right through the windshield, right into my eyes. Its eyes, God, its eyes. They weren't like an animal's eyes. They were this weird light color, like a pale yellow, and they seemed to catch the light and throw it back at me. There was an intelligence in them, a mean, cold intelligence. It wasn't just looking. It was glaring, like it was angry I was there, like I was trespassing. My heart just seized up in my chest. It was like a fist had closed around it. I didn't even think. I stomped on the brake, the truck tires skidding on the frozen gravel. The whole rig shuddered and I swerved, the back end fishtailing. I missed it by inches. I felt the whoosh of air, saw the dark mass of it right there in my passenger window. I came to a stop, maybe 20, 30 feet past it, the engine stuttering. I was panting, my breath coming out in ragged white clouds in the cold cab. My hands were glued to the wheel, shaking so bad I could feel the vibration all the way up my arms. I couldn't move. I just sat there, staring into the rearview mirror, and it was still there. It hadn't moved. It hadn't flinched. It had just turned its head, those pale eyes following me, watching my truck skid to a halt. It was still glaring. It wasn't scared of the truck. It wasn't scared of the noise. It was just standing its ground, menacing. That's the only word for it. It felt menacing. The fear that hit me then was like nothing I'd ever felt. It wasn't just being startled. This was a deep, primal, gut-level terror. Every hair on my body was standing up. My skin was crawling. I felt cold all over, a cold that had nothing to do with the night air. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't just sit and look at it in the mirror. I jammed the gear shift into first and slammed my foot down on the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, the engine roaring. I didn't look back again. I just drove. I drove like hell itself was chasing me. I didn't even know where I was going for a minute, just away. My whole body was trembling, my teeth chattering. I could smell my own sweat, a sharp, sour smell of pure fear. The next place I knew was a restaurant and filling station about 5 miles down the road. A place called Ernie's. It was a beacon of light in all that darkness. I pulled into the gravel lot so fast, I almost hit the gas pump. I killed the engine and just sat for a second, trying to catch my breath, but my lungs wouldn't work right. I stumbled out of the truck, my legs feeling like rubber. I almost fell on the gravel. The place was warm and bright inside, smelling of grease and coffee. There were a few men sitting at the counter, local fellas, and Ernie himself was behind it, wiping down a mug. They all looked up when I came in. I must have been a sight. My face was white as a sheet. I was covered in a cold sweat, and I was shaking so hard I could barely walk straight. Ernie took one look at me and said, "Charlie, good Lord, man, you look like you've seen a ghost." I tried to speak, but my throat was tight. I just shook my head and made my way to the counter, gripping the edge to hold myself up. "Coffee," I managed to croak out. Ernie poured a cup and slid it to me. My hands were shaking so violently that when I tried to pick it up, I sloshed hot coffee all over my hand and the counter. I didn't even feel the burn. I just stared at the brown liquid spreading across the formica. "What in the world is wrong with you, Charlie?" one of the men asked. His name was Bill, I think, a farmer. I took a deep, shuddering breath. It took me a few tries to get the words out. I saw something on the road, back near the creek bend. "A deer?" Ernie asked. "You hit a deer?" "No," I said, my voice a little stronger now, but still shaky. "It wasn't a deer. It was standing up, like a man, but it was covered in hair, all over. Its face, its eyes." I described it as best I could. The height, the hair, the way it stood, those pale, glaring eyes. I told them how it didn't run, how it just watched me, how I felt this hate coming off of it. The men were quiet, just listening. Their faces were serious. They weren't laughing. That was the first thing I noticed. They weren't laughing at me. When I finished, Bill set his own coffee cup down with a firm click. "We've been hearing things," he said, his voice low, "for weeks now. Weird cries from the woods, not a fox, not a bobcat, something else." Another man, younger, named Jake, nodded. "My dog's been going crazy some nights, won't go outside, just stands at the door and growls." There was a heavy silence. Then Bill looked at Ernie. "You got your shotgun here?" Ernie nodded and reached under the counter, pulling out a pump-action shotgun. Bill looked at the other men. "I've got my rifle in the truck." "Jake, you got yours?" Jake nodded. They all looked at me. "You want to show us where, Charlie?" Bill asked. I did not want to. The thought of going back to that spot made my stomach clench into a hard knot. But I also knew I had to. I couldn't just let it go. I had to know if I was going crazy. So I nodded, a short, jerky motion. We piled into 2 trucks, mine and Bill's. I led the way, driving slower this time, my heart hammering against my ribs again. The fear was back, a cold stone in my belly. Every shadow looked like it was moving. Every tree stump looked like a crouching figure. When we got to the curve, I pulled over exactly where I'd stopped before. The other truck pulled in behind me. The men got out, shotguns and rifles in hand, their breath pluming in the cold air. They turned on flashlights, the beams cutting through the dark, dancing over the frozen ground and the bare trees. For a minute, nothing. It was just the cold, quiet woods. Then Jake called out, "Over here!" We all went over to where he was standing, near the edge of the ditch where I'd seen the thing. The ground was frozen hard, covered in a skim of frost, and there, plain as day, were marks. Not footprints, not exactly. The ground was too hard for clear tracks, but there were places where the leaf litter and moss had been scuffed away, and a few small flat rocks had been upturned, their dark, damp undersides exposed to the air. It looked like something heavy had been standing there, shifting its weight. Something had definitely been there. Bill knelt down, running his hand over one of the overturned rocks. "Ain't no deer did this," he muttered. We searched the area for another 15-20 minutes, but we didn't find anything else. No hair, no clear prints, nothing. But the upturned rocks were enough. They believed me. They'd heard the stories, and now they'd seen the signs. We stood there in a small circle, the beams of our flashlights pointing at the ground, and nobody said much of anything. The woods were dead silent. Not a cricket, not an owl. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like it's pressing in on your ears. We drove back to the station. The mood was different. The men were quiet, thoughtful. They talked in low tones about organizing a proper hunt on the weekend, getting more men together with dogs. They clapped me on the shoulder and told me I wasn't crazy. When I finally got home, it was past 1 in the morning. Miss Stover was waiting up for me, worried sick. I told her everything, the whole story, from the glare of those eyes to the upturned rocks. She listened, her face pale, and when I was done, she just put her arms around me. She believed me too. She knew me. She knew I wasn't a liar, and I wasn't a drunk. She said the community would look into it, that I'd done the right thing by telling the men. I didn't sleep that night. Not a wink. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. That thing, standing there on the side of the road, glaring at me with those pale, intelligent eyes, full of a kind of cold anger I'd never seen in any living thing. The image was burned into the back of my eyelids. The next few days there were hunts. Men with guns and dogs went through those woods. They found a few more strange marks, places where something big seemed to have bedded down in thickets, but they never saw it. They never caught it. After a while, the searches died down. Life went on, but I never forgot. I drove that route for another 5 years before I retired, and I never took that particular cut through again after dark. Not ever. I'd go the long way, every single time, and sometimes, even in the daylight when I'd pass that curve, I'd feel a chill, that same primal fear tickling the back of my neck. It changed me. It made the world feel less safe, less known. The woods weren't just woods anymore. They were a place where something like that could be hiding, watching. The community talked about it for a long time. My boss at the bakery believed me. Other locals came forward with their own stories of strange cries and things seen from a distance. It became a part of the local lore, I guess. But for me, it wasn't a story. It was a memory, a sharp, cold, terrifying memory. I'm an old man now. I've lived a long life, seen a lot of things. But nothing ever got to me like that thing did. The sheer terror of that moment, seeing it there, so close, so real, so utterly wrong. It's something that stays with you. It's in your bones. And even now, all these years later, if I let myself think about it too much, I can still see those eyes, just glaring. Story 12. Okay, so I've been sitting on this for a while, and I don't really know how to start, but I need to get it out. I've never told anyone this because, honestly, who would believe me? But I've been reading some stories on here, and it feels like maybe someone will get it. This happened to me about 2 years ago, and I still think about it all the time. It was one of those things that just sticks with you, you know? Like your brain can't process it, so it just loops over and over. So, here's the deal. I was driving through the Navajo Indian Reservation in Arizona. It was late, really late, like past midnight, and I was alone. I'd been on the road for hours, just me and my old pickup truck. I'd planned this camping trip for weeks, wanting to get away from everything, but I'd underestimated how long it would take to find a decent spot. The map showed a bunch of dirt roads east of the main highway, along the southern part of the reservation, so I figured I'd head that way. Big mistake in hindsight. The road was this washboard dirt thing, all bumpy and uneven, so I was driving slow, maybe 20 miles an hour. My headlights were cutting through the darkness, but it was one of those pitch-black nights where there's no moon, and the stars are just tiny pinpricks way up high. The desert out there is huge and empty, nothing but scrub and sand and these weird twisted trees that look like they're holding secrets. I had the windows down a crack because the air was cool, but every time I hit a bump, dust would swirl in and I could taste it, dry and gritty, like old earth. I remember my hands were tight on the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I was tired, my eyes straining to see ahead, and my back was starting to ache from sitting so long. The radio was just static because I was way out of range, so it was just the sound of the engine and the tires crunching over the gravel. Every now and then, I'd see a pair of eyes reflecting back from the side of the road, probably coyotes or rabbits, but they'd dart away quick. It was lonely, but in a peaceful way, or at least that's what I thought at first. Then I crested this small rise in the road. It wasn't a big hill, just enough that the headlights dipped down and then swept upward as I went over it. And that's when I saw it. My heart just dropped into my stomach. About 40 feet ahead, something stepped out from the left side of the road. It was moving fast, walking briskly on a diagonal, crossing right in front of me. The headlights caught it full on, and I swear time just slowed down. This thing was covered in dark brown hair, like matted fur, and it was tall, maybe 6 feet, but it seemed bigger because of how it moved. It had a solid, broad-shouldered build, like a weightlifter, but with these long arms that swung as it walked. It didn't look at me, not once. Its head was kind of down, and it just kept going, smooth and steady, like it had somewhere to be. The way it moved was unnatural. Not like a person, but not like an animal either. It was too upright, too confident. In that split second, my mind screamed ape, but I knew that was impossible. There are no apes in the Arizona desert. None. So what the hell was it? It crossed the road in maybe 2 seconds, and then it bent down behind this bush on the right side and just disappeared into the desert. Like, one moment it was there, and the next, gone. Vanished. The whole thing was so quiet too. No sound, no rustling, nothing. Just the hum of my engine and my own breathing, which had gone all shallow. I slammed on the brakes and the truck skidded a little on the loose dirt. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I just sat there, staring at the spot where it had been. My hands were shaking and I had to grip the wheel to steady them. For a second, I thought maybe I'd imagined it. Too tired, too stressed. But no, I saw it clear as day. The image was burned into my brain. That dark, hairy shape moving across the road, never breaking stride. I put the truck in park and left the engine running. The headlights were still on, pointing where it had gone. I leaned forward, squinting, trying to see past the bush. But there was nothing. Just darkness and shadows that seemed to shift every time I blinked. I remember my mouth was dry and I kept swallowing, but it didn't help. I thought about getting out, but hell no. No way. Whatever that was, I didn't want to meet it. So I did the only thing I could think of. I slowly pulled over to the side of the road, keeping the lights aimed where I'd seen it disappear. I rolled down the window a bit more, listening. The desert was dead silent. No crickets, no wind, nothing. It was like everything had stopped to watch. I sat there for what felt like forever, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, just scanning the area with my headlights. I moved them side to side, hoping to catch a glimpse of movement, but there was nothing. The bush it had bent behind was just a clump of scrub, no bigger than my truck, and beyond that it was just open desert stretching out into blackness. My mind was racing. What was that thing? A bear. But bears don't walk like that. They're more lumbering, and they don't have that kind of build. Plus, I've seen bears before, and this was different. The hair was too uniform, too, covering, and the way it ignored me completely. That was the creepiest part. It didn't even glance my way, like I was nothing. That sent a chill down my spine that I can still feel now, just thinking about it. It was like I'd stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to see, something that belonged here, and I was the intruder. I started to feel exposed, sitting there in the truck. The darkness felt heavy, pressing in on me. Every little sound, the creak of the truck, my own breathing, made me jump. I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to find somewhere else to sleep, but the idea of pitching a tent was out of the question. No way was I sleeping outside tonight. So I put the truck in drive and started moving again, slow at first, then faster as I got away from that spot. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me, but it was just empty road behind. My hands were still shaky, and I had to wipe my palms on my jeans because they were sweaty. The drive felt endless. Every shadow looked like it might move. Every bush seemed like it could hide something. I was hyper-aware of everything, my eyes darting around, my ears straining for any noise. After about 20 minutes, I found a slightly wider spot in the road, where it looked like other people had pulled over before. It wasn't ideal, but it felt safer than being out in the open. I parked the truck, making sure it was facing the road so I could see if anything came. I turned off the engine, and the silence was deafening. No more hum, just this thick quiet that made my skin crawl. I climbed into the back of the truck. I have a camper shell on it, so it's like a little enclosed space. I didn't bother changing or anything. I just lay down on my sleeping bag, fully clothed. My heart was still racing, and I could feel this cold sweat on my forehead. I kept replaying what I'd seen over and over in my head. That smooth, brisk walk, The way it bent down and disappeared. It was so fluid, so purposeful. Why didn't it look at me? Was it not interested, or was it avoiding eye contact? I don't know, but it freaked me out. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I'd see it crossing the road. I'd jerk awake, thinking I heard something outside. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, soft, like something big moving quietly. But when I sat up and listened, there was nothing. Maybe it was just the desert settling, or my imagination. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I ended up curling into a ball, pulling the sleeping bag over my head like a kid. But it didn't help. I could still feel the weight of the night, the isolation. The hours dragged on. I'd checked my phone for the time, but there was no service, so it was just me and the dark. I must have dozed off eventually, because I woke up to the first light of dawn seeping through the camper shell windows. The desert was starting to come alive with the sounds of birds and the faint rustle of wind. It should have felt comforting, but I was still on edge. I sat up slowly, my body stiff from tension, and peered out the window. Everything looked normal, just sand, rocks, and scrubby plants. No signs of anything unusual. I got out of the truck and stretched, my muscles aching. The air was cool and fresh, but I couldn't enjoy it. I kept glancing around, half expecting to see footprints or something, but the ground was hard-packed dirt, and there was nothing, no tracks, no broken branches, nothing to prove what I'd seen. It was like it never happened, but I knew it did. That image was burned into me. I drove back to the main highway as soon as the sun was fully up, not even bothering to look for a campsite anymore. The whole way, I kept thinking about what it could have been. I've heard stories about Bigfoot or skinwalkers in that area, but I never put much stock in them. Now I don't know. Maybe it was something else, something that doesn't have a name. All I know is that I've never felt fear like that before, a deep, primal fear that sits in your bones and doesn't let go. I've been back to the desert since then, but never alone, and never on that road. Sometimes when I'm driving at night, I'll see something move in the headlights, and my heart will skip a beat. But it's always just a deer or a coyote, nothing like what I saw that night. I still can't explain it, and I doubt I ever will. It's just one of those things that happened, and now I have to live with it. Story 13. We'd set up camp in a pretty remote spot, deep in the woods where you couldn't hear anything but the wind and the occasional animal noise. It was around dusk when things started to feel off. The sun had just dipped below the trees, and the light was fading fast. We'd built a decent-sized fire to keep warm and cook dinner. Just some hot dogs and beans, nothing fancy. The air was cool and crisp, typical for October, and everything seemed normal at first. We were joking around, talking about work and life, and generally enjoying the peace. But then, as the fire crackled and cast flickering shadows on the trees around us, I noticed something moving at the edge of the light. At first I thought it was a deer, or maybe a bear, because we'd seen signs of both earlier, but then it stepped closer, and my heart just dropped. This thing was massive. I'm not exaggerating when I say it had to be close to 9 feet tall. Its skin was pale, almost white, and it had this wild, shaggy hair that looked silver in the firelight. But the worst part was its eyes. They were glowing red, like two coals burning in the dark. It was just standing there, maybe 30 feet away, and it let out this low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate right through me. I froze, and I could see the other guys had noticed it too. One of them whispered, "What the hell is that?" But none of us had an answer. The growl wasn't like anything I'd ever heard. It was deep and angry, like it was pissed off we were there. We all kind of stumbled back toward the fire, grabbing whatever was nearby for protection. I had a camping knife, but it felt useless against something that big. The creature didn't move closer right away. It just stood there, watching us with those red eyes, and the growling kept coming in waves. Then from the woods around us we started hearing knocks, not like someone tapping on a door, but heavy rhythmic thuds, like something huge was hitting trees with a lot of force. They were coming from all directions, left, right, front, back, above, below, right, behind us, and it felt like we were surrounded. Within minutes, rocks and branches started flying into the camp. Not little pebbles, but fist-sized rocks that thudded against the ground and our tents. One hit our cooler and dented it badly. Another whizzed past my head so close I felt the air move. We ducked down, crouching by the fire, and I remember the heat from the flames mixing with the cold sweat on my skin. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold onto my knife. The knocks kept echoing, and now we could hear more growls, deeper ones from different parts of the woods. It was like there were multiple creatures out there communicating with each other. Then another one showed up. This one was darker, with fur that looked almost black in the dim light. It was bigger than the white one, if that's even possible, and it moved fast. It charged into the camp, not directly at us, but toward our tents. It tore into them like they were made of paper, ripping the fabric and scattering our gear everywhere. Sleeping bags, food supplies, even our backpacks. It all went flying. The sound of the tent poles snapping was sharp and terrifying. We were huddled together by the fire, too scared to move. I could feel the guy next to me trembling, and someone was breathing so fast I thought they might hyperventilate. The white creature started moving closer, step by step. It was clenching its fists, and I could see the muscles in its arms tensing. Its red eyes never left us, and the growling got louder. The darker one was still rampaging, throwing our stuff around, and every time it moved, the ground seemed to shake a little. We could hear heavy breathing, not ours, but theirs. It was raspy and loud, like they were working hard, and it mixed with the knocks and growls to create this chaotic symphony of fear. The air smelled like pine and smoke, but also this weird, musky odor I can't even describe, like wet fur and something rotten. We were trapped there for what felt like hours. Time just dragged on. The fire started to die down, and nobody dared to add more wood because we didn't want to draw more attention. The cold seeped into my bones, and I was shivering, but not just from the temperature. Every time a rock landed nearby or a branch snapped, I'd jump. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. We tried to stay quiet, whispering to each other to keep calm, but it was impossible. One of the guys suggested making a run for it, but where would we go? The knocks were everywhere, and we had no idea how many of them were out there. At one point, the white creature let out this roar. I mean, a full-on ear-splitting roar that seemed to shake the air around us. It was so loud I felt it in my chest, like a physical force. The red eyes were fixed on us, and I swear, in that moment, I saw pure anger in them. Not just animal aggression, but something more intelligent, more malevolent. It was the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced. I thought we were going to die right there. The fear was so intense, it felt like a weight on my chest, and I couldn't breathe properly. I remember squeezing my eyes shut for a second, praying it would just end. The roaring stopped, but the creatures didn't leave. They kept circling us, communicating with those growls and knocks. It was like they were toying with us, keeping us pinned down. The darker one would occasionally lunge at something in the camp, and we'd flinch every time. I could see our supplies scattered all over, a torn map, a broken lantern, food wrappers everywhere. The tents were shredded, and one of our sleeping bags was hanging from a tree branch. It was surreal, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. As the night wore on, the sky started to lighten slightly. Dawn was coming, and with it, a faint hope that we might survive this. The creatures seemed to sense it too. The knocks grew less frequent, and the growling softened. Then, just as the first rays of sun peeked through the trees, the white creature gave one final grunt, a short, sharp sound, and turned away. It disappeared into the trees so smoothly it was like it had never been there. The darker one followed, and within minutes the forest fell completely silent. No knocks, no growls, nothing. Not even the usual birds chirping or insects buzzing. It was eerily quiet, like the whole world was holding its breath. We didn't waste any time. As soon as we were sure they were gone, we started gathering what was left of our stuff. Our hands were still shaking, and we moved in a frantic, silent hurry. The camp was a wreck. Tents destroyed, gear missing or broken. We stuffed whatever we could salvage into our backpacks and just started walking, not even bothering to put out the fire properly. We didn't talk much. We were too scared and exhausted. The hike back to the car felt like it took forever, and every sound in the woods made us jump. When we finally reached the parking area, we piled into the car and drove off without looking back. I still don't know what exactly we encountered that night. Bigfoot? Something else? All I know is that it was real and it was hostile. The memory of those red eyes and that roar haunts me to this day. I can't go into the woods anymore without feeling that same fear creeping up on me. We never reported it to anyone because who would believe us? But I had to share this here because if anyone else has been through something similar, maybe they'll understand. That night in October 2016 changed everything for us, and I'll never forget the feeling of being so completely and utterly helpless. Story 14. I still can't believe I'm typing this out, but I need to get it off my chest. We were living at Ruskin Cave Recreational Park in Tennessee last summer because I had a gig there doing maintenance work. It's one of those places that's supposed to be all peaceful and natural, with dense woods and these huge caves that tourists love. We were staying in a small cabin near the edge of the park, kind of isolated but not too far from the main areas. It felt safe, you know, like the kind of place where you let your kids run around without worrying too much. That particular day started out normal. It was a warm, humid afternoon, and I'd spent most of it fixing up some fencing near one of the trails. My daughter, she's 14, had been hanging out with a couple of friends whose families were camping nearby. They'd gone off to explore or whatever teens do, and I didn't think much of it. She's a good kid, responsible, and she knew the area well enough. But as it got later, around dusk, I started feeling a little uneasy. Not sure why, just a gut thing. The woods get dark fast out there, and the sounds change. Crickets get louder, and sometimes you hear things moving in the underbrush. I was inside the cabin trying to relax after work, maybe watching some TV, but I kept glancing at the clock. She'd said she'd be back before full dark, but it was getting really late. I mean, the kind of late where the sky is pitch black and you can't see your hand in front of your face without a light. I had the porch light on, and I'd cracked the window open a bit to let some air in. It was sticky hot, and the fan wasn't doing much. Then I heard footsteps on the gravel path leading up to the cabin. Not the usual light steps she has. These were hurried, stumbling. My heart jumped a little, and I got up to look out the peephole. When I saw her, my stomach dropped. She was pale as a ghost, shaking like she'd been out in the cold for hours, but it was a warm night. She pushed the door open and just stood there, breathing hard, not saying a word. Her eyes were wide, and she had this blank look, like she wasn't really seeing me. I rushed over and put my hands on her shoulders. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" I asked, but she didn't answer. She just shook her head slowly, and that's when I noticed she was clutching this small plastic bag, the kind you get from a convenience store with some candy in it. It was half empty, and the top was torn, like someone had grabbed it. I guided her to the couch, and she sat down stiffly, still not talking. Her clothes were a mess, leaves stuck to her jeans, and there was dirt on her arms. I knelt down in front of her. "Honey, you need to tell me what happened." My voice was shaky because I could see she was in shock. It took her a minute, but she finally started to speak, her words coming out in a jumble. She said she was walking home from her friend's campsite, taking the shortcut through the woods like she always does. It's a trail we've used a bunch of times, but it's narrow and gets really dark at night. She had a flashlight, but the batteries were dying, so it was just a dim glow. She told me she heard something behind her, a heavy rustling like something big moving through the bushes. At first she thought it was a deer or maybe a bear, because we've seen those around, but then it got closer. And she felt this presence like something was right on her heels. She sped up, but whatever it was kept pace. Then out of nowhere, something grabbed her from behind. Not her arm or anything, it went for the candy bag she was holding. She said it felt like a hand, but huge and rough, with fingers that dug into her back through her shirt. She struggled, yanking away, and the bag ripped. The thing let go, but not before it left a bruise. She showed me her back, and I lifted her shirt to see. There was a dark, purplish mark right between her shoulder blades, about the size of a large handprint. It was already swelling a bit, and the skin was tender when I touched it gently. As she was explaining this, her voice trembling, I felt this cold dread wash over me. My mind was racing. Could it have been a person? But who would be out there in the woods at that hour, attacking a kid for candy? It didn't make sense. I stood up and walked to the window, the one facing the woods. I just had this urge to look outside, like maybe I'd see something that would explain it. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, maybe 5 or 6 feet away from the window, was this figure. It was massive, taller than any man I've ever seen, and built like a gorilla, but standing upright. Its body was covered in dark, matted hair that looked almost black in the dim light from the cabin. But it was the face that got me. It had these deep-set eyes that seemed to glow faintly, and they were locked right on me. The expression wasn't angry or wild. It was calm, almost curious, but in a way that felt predatory, like it was studying me, taking me in. Its mouth was slightly open, and I could see these broad, flat teeth. The sheer size of it. I'd guess it was over 7 feet tall, with shoulders so wide they blocked out the trees behind it. For a second, I couldn't move. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it would burst out of my chest. I felt dizzy, like the room was spinning, and I had to grab the windowsill to steady myself. My vision tunneled, and I honestly thought I was going to black out. I've never felt fear like that. It was primal, deep in my gut. I managed to stumble back from the window, my legs feeling like jelly, and I must have made a noise because my daughter looked up and asked what was wrong. I couldn't answer her. I just stood there, shaking, trying to process what I'd seen. When I gathered enough courage to look again, it was gone, vanished into the darkness like it was never there. But the image was burned into my mind. I rushed to lock the door and check all the windows, my hands trembling so bad I could barely turn the locks. I pulled the curtains shut, but I kept feeling like those eyes were still on me, watching through the walls. We spent the rest of that night huddled on the couch, not sleeping, just listening to every little sound outside. The woods were quieter than usual, like even the animals knew something was wrong. My daughter eventually fell asleep from exhaustion, but I stayed awake, jumping at every rustle or creak. I kept replaying it in my head. The size of it, how close it was, the way it stared. It wasn't like in movies where monsters roar and charge. This was silent, intense, and that made it even scarier. I felt violated, like our safe space had been invaded. The next morning, I inspected the area outside the window. There were no footprints. The ground was too dry and covered in pine needles, but I found a few broken branches nearby, as if something heavy had brushed past them. I didn't report it to anyone because, honestly, who would believe me? They'd think I was crazy, or that it was a bear. But I've seen bears, and this was nothing like that. As the summer went on, other people in the park started talking about hearing these screams at night. Not human screams, but something deeper, more guttural, that echoed through the valleys. The first time I heard it, I was outside taking out the trash, and it froze me in my tracks. It was this long, drawn-out sound that started low and rose to a piercing shriek, then faded away. It made the hair on my arms stand up, and I felt this cold sweat break out all over my body. I've heard coyotes and bobcats, but this was different. It had a weight to it, like it was shaking the air around us. People would gather and talk about it in hushed voices. Grown men, tough guys who've worked in the woods for years, would admit that it made them feel like crying. One guy said it reminded him of something from a nightmare, and he couldn't sleep for days after hearing it. The animals reacted too. Dogs would bark uncontrollably or whimper and hide, and even the horses in the stables would get spooked and hard to handle. Every time those screams happened, I'd think back to that night and the thing at the window. It felt connected, like it was still out there, reminding us. The fear never really went away. It just settled into a constant low-level anxiety that hung over the whole season. We started avoiding the woods after dark, and I never let my daughter walk alone again, even during the day. Now, months later, I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night sweating because I dream about those eyes staring at me. I can't explain what it was. Bigfoot, some unknown animal or something else, but I know what I saw and I know how it made me feel. That moment, seeing it so close, changed something in me. I look at the woods differently now, with a respect that borders on fear. And every time I hear a strange noise at night, my heart skips a beat and I wonder if it's still out there watching. Story 15. It was the third evening of our hunting trip, and I was still hunting along an old skid trail, hoping to catch an elk moving through before dark. The air had that crisp, cold bite to it that comes with autumn in the Cascades, the kind that makes your nose tingle and your breath fog up in little puffs. I was about a mile from camp, maybe a little more, just far enough that the world had gone quiet, except for the sounds of the forest. My friend was back at camp, probably starting a fire and getting coffee going. We'd split up to cover more ground, a standard move for us. This was our fourth year coming out to this same general area near Mount St. Helens, a tradition we'd started after we both got out of the service. It was our way of unwinding, of feeling normal again. The skid trail was overgrown but still usable, a remnant from the logging that had happened years before. It was a narrow path, really, with ferns and huckleberry bushes crowding in on both sides. The ground was soft under my boots, a thick carpet of moss and decaying needles from the Douglas firs and hemlocks that towered overhead. The light was starting to go, that long golden hour light that slants through the trees and makes everything look like it's glowing. I was moving slow, maybe taking a step every 10 or 15 seconds, my eyes scanning the shadows between the trees, my ears straining for any sound that wasn't just the wind or a squirrel. My rifle, a .30-06, felt solid and familiar in my hands, the cold metal of the barrel a constant reminder of why I was out there. But honestly, at that moment, I was more just enjoying the peace than anything else. It's a feeling you only get out in the deep woods, a kind of silence that's so complete it almost has a weight to it. I remember thinking how clear the air smelled, all pine and damp earth. I'd stopped on a slight rise in the trail, looking down into a clear-cut area below me. It was an old cut, maybe a decade old, so it was filled with a jungle of young alders and vine maples, a real thicket. That's where the elk would often move, using the cover to travel unseen. I was standing there, not moving a muscle, just watching the cut. My heart was beating a slow, steady rhythm. I was completely focused, the way you get when you're hunting, where every one of your senses is dialed up to 10. And then I saw movement. It was down in the cut, maybe 70, 80 yards away at first. It wasn't the flicker of a deer's ear or the cautious step of an elk. This was different. It was a shift in the shadows, a bulk that resolved itself into a shape. At first, my brain tried to make it into a bear. That's what you see out here, black bears. But this was upright, standing on two legs, and it was too big, way too big. It stepped clear of a thick patch of alders, and I got an unobstructed view, and my mind just stalled. It was like a circuit breaker in my head tripped. This thing was massive. It wasn't just tall, it was wide. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, way wider than any man's, even a huge football player. It was covered in hair, dark brown, almost black, and it looked long and kind of shaggy. The light was hitting it from the side, and I could see the muscle definition in its shoulders and back. It wasn't a flabby thing. It was powerfully built, like a weightlifter or a gorilla. Its head was set low on its shoulders, no real neck to speak of. Just this powerful mound of muscle that its head seemed to sink into. I stopped breathing. I'm not exaggerating. My lungs just locked up. My fingers were still curled around the rifle stock, but the thought of raising it, of aiming, never even crossed my mind. It wasn't a target. It was a person. I know that sounds crazy, but in that moment, it didn't feel like an animal. It felt like a person, a very, very large, hairy person. It was moving across the slope below me, angling from my left to my right. It wasn't in a hurry. It walked with this strange, fluid gait. Its legs had a flex to them, like its knees were bent more than a human's, giving it a kind of rolling motion, and its arms were too long. They swung as it walked, but the swing was wrong. They didn't pendulum like our arms do. They had more of an arc to them, and they seemed to swing from its shoulders, not its hips. The proportions were just off, in a way that was deeply unsettling. It was built all wrong. The smell hit me then. I hadn't noticed it at first, probably because I was so stunned, but as it moved, the wind shifted and it carried this odor right to me. It was strong, overpowering. It wasn't a skunk smell or a dead animal smell. It was musky, like a wet dog, but mixed with something else, something wild and pungent, like a barn that hasn't been cleaned in a year. It was a physical presence in the air, so thick I could almost taste it at the back of my throat. It was the smell of something alive and potent, and it made the hair on my arms stand up. It was about 50 yards below me now, just trudging along, completely unaware of me, or just not caring. I was frozen solid, not out of courage, but out of pure, unadulterated terror. It was a primal fear, the kind you don't learn. The kind that's baked into your DNA from a time when things like this were what you were afraid of in the dark. My heart wasn't beating slow anymore. It was hammering against my ribs like it was trying to get out. I could feel a cold sweat break out all over my body, under my clothes, on my forehead. My mouth was dry as dust. I watched its back as it moved. The muscles in its back and shoulders rippled under that dark mat of hair with every step. It was so powerful. I kept thinking, if it turned around and saw me, if it decided to come up the hill, there was nothing I could do. The rifle in my hands felt like a toy. Useless. It wasn't threatening me. It was just passing through. But its mere existence was a threat to my entire understanding of the world. It reached the far tree line, a solid wall of dark green hemlocks. It didn't pause. It didn't look back. It just stepped into the shadows between two big trees and was gone. 1 second it was there, a massive, impossible figure silhouetted against the fading light. And the next second, the forest had swallowed it whole. I didn't move. I stood there for what felt like an hour, just staring at the spot where it had disappeared. The smell lingered for a few minutes, a ghost in the air, and then it too began to fade, replaced by the normal sense of the forest. The spell was broken. My body unlocked all at once, and I sucked in a huge, ragged gasp of air. My legs felt like jelly. I actually had to put a hand on a tree trunk to steady myself because I was shaking so bad. It was a full-body tremor, like I was freezing cold, even though I was sweating. I looked down at my rifle. My knuckles were white from how hard I'd been gripping it. I forced my fingers to relax one by one. My first coherent thought was, I have to get back to camp. But I was terrified to move. What if it was still out there? What if it was watching me? What if there were more of them? The forest, which had felt so peaceful minutes before, now felt menacing. Every shadow looked like it could hold another one. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a footstep. I made myself move. I didn't run. Running felt like a bad idea, like it might trigger a chase response in whatever that was. I just started walking, as quickly and quietly as I could, back the way I'd come. I kept my rifle ready, but it felt like a hollow gesture. My head was on a swivel, my eyes darting into every dark space between the trees. The walk back to camp was the longest mile of my life. Every snap of a twig made me jump. Every time the wind sighed through the tops of the firs, I froze, thinking it was that low guttural sound I imagined it would make. When I finally saw the orange glow of our campfire through the trees, I almost cried with relief. I broke into a jog for the last 100 yards, stumbling into the clearing where we'd set up our tents. My friend was sitting on a log by the fire, poking at the flames with a stick. He looked up as I came in, and his expression changed immediately. He could see it on my face. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his voice low and serious. I just stood there, breathing hard, my hands still shaking. I dropped my rifle onto my sleeping bag and went over to the fire, holding my hands out to the warmth, trying to stop the tremors. "I saw something," I managed to get out. My voice was hoarse. He didn't say anything, just waited. He's a quiet guy, my friend. He knows when to listen. I told him everything. I started from the beginning, me on the skid trail, the light, the movement in the cut. I described the figure in as much detail as I could. The size, the width of the shoulders, the dark, almost black hair, the low-set head. I told him about the way it walked, that flex in its legs, the wrong swing of its arms. I told him about the smell, that musky animal stench that filled the air. I told him how I froze, how I never even thought to shoot, how it just moved across the slope and vanished into the trees. I was talking fast, my words tumbling over each other, desperate to get it all out. I expected him to laugh. I expected him to tell me I was crazy, that it was a bear, that the light was playing tricks on me. That's what I would have done if our roles were reversed. But he didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. He just listened, his eyes on the fire, his face grim. When I finished, there was a long silence, broken only by the crackle of the burning wood. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "You're not the first," he said. "I've heard stories from guys who've hunted up here for years, old-timers. They talk about seeing things like that, big, hairy things that walk on two legs. They call them all sorts of names. Mostly, they just don't talk about it at all." He looked at me then, and his eyes were dead serious. "They say the area around the mountain is different." We didn't talk much after that. We just sat by the fire, drinking coffee, lost in our own thoughts. The image of that thing was burned into the back of my eyelids. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again. That dark, bulky form moving with that impossible gait through the old clear cut. We packed up and left first thing the next morning. Neither of us had the heart to hunt anymore. That was in the late 90s. We never went back to that specific spot. I've been hunting since, but never again with the same feeling of peace. I'm always watching the shadows now, always listening for a sound that doesn't fit. I've read the books, I've watched the TV shows, and I know what people say. They talk about Bigfoot, Sasquatch. I don't know what it was. I don't have a name for it. All I know is what I saw with my own eyes. I saw something that shouldn't exist, something that defied everything I thought I knew. It was real. It was physical. It was there. And for about 30 seconds, as it crossed that slope 50 yards below me, my entire world shifted on its axis, and it's never quite shifted back. The memory is as clear and sharp today as it was on that cold autumn evening. It's just there, a permanent picture in my mind, and I still can't explain it. Story 16. Okay, I'll try to write this out. I've never really typed the whole thing up before, just told a couple of close friends who ended up looking at me like I was crazy. But I've been reading this forum for a while, and I figure if anyone might get it, it's you all. So here goes. This happened back in October of 2021. I was staying at my family's old cabin way up in northern Pennsylvania. I'd gone up there alone for a few days. From the 8th to the 11th, I needed to get away from everything. Work, the noise, just everything. The cabin's been in the family for years, and I'd spent a lot of time there as a kid. It was always my safe place. Quiet, peaceful, not anymore. Not after that. I got there on the Friday the 8th, right around dusk. The drive up was fine. Just the usual winding roads getting narrower and darker the deeper you go into the woods. I pulled my truck into the gravel clearing we use as a driveway, killed the engine and just sat for a minute. The silence was immediate and total. It's a heavy kind of quiet up there, the kind that presses in on your ears. I got out and started unloading my stuff. The air was cool and crisp, that specific fall chill that smells like dead leaves and damp earth. I remember seeing a couple of deer at the edge of the tree line, just past the overgrown lawn. They froze for a second, watching me, then bounded off into the woods. Normal stuff. I'd seen it 100 times. It was getting dark fast, the kind of deep blue dark that comes quick in the mountains. I had a bunch of gear in the truck, including a big handheld spotlight we use for checking the property at night, mostly for spotting deer eyes. After I'd hauled my duffel bag and the cooler up to the porch, I decided to just do a quick sweep with the light, more out of habit than anything. I wasn't expecting trouble. I never did up there. I clicked the spotlight on, and the beam cut a stark white path through the darkness. I panned it slowly across the field that stretches out behind the cabin. At first, it was just the usual, the tall, browning grass, the dark shapes of trees in the distance. Then I saw the eyes. Deer eyes shine white or a sort of greenish yellow when you hit them with a light. These weren't deer eyes, these were red, a deep, glowing coals in a furnace red. And there were two sets of them side by side about, I don't know, maybe 8 feet off the ground, way too high for any deer or bear. My brain just sort of stuttered. It didn't compute. I held the light steady, my arms starting to feel a little numb. The eyes weren't moving erratically like an animal's would. They were moving together, steadily, purposefully, coming across the field towards the tree line near the house. They weren't bouncing or darting. It was a smooth, deliberate glide. A chill went down my spine, a physical cold feeling that started at the base of my neck and just poured down my back. It was a feeling I'd never had before, a kind of primal, deep-in-your-guts wrongness. I clicked the light off. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I stood there in the dark for a minute, just listening. I couldn't hear anything but the blood pounding in my ears. I tried to rationalize it. An optical illusion, some weird reflection. But I know what I saw. I've been in these woods my whole life. I know what a coyote looks like, what a fox looks like, what a bear looks like. This wasn't any of them. This was something else. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me, which felt stupid because I never locked the cabin door. The lock was old and rusty, and I had to really force the deadbolt. I turned on all the lights downstairs, the old yellowy bulbs doing little to push back the feeling of the immense darkness outside. Later that night, maybe a couple hours after I'd seen the eyes, I was still wound up. I went out onto the second-floor balcony, the one off the main bedroom, to try and smoke a cigarette and calm my nerves. The air was dead still, no wind at all. I was leaning on the railing, looking out into the blackness, when I heard the first snap. It was a branch breaking, a thick one, not the little crunch of a squirrel or a raccoon. This was a loud, sharp crack that echoed in the quiet. It came from my left, down near the old shed. I froze, the cigarette halfway to my lips. Then another one, from my right this time, further out but still too close for comfort. Then another, straight ahead from the tree line. They weren't random. They were spaced out like someone or something was moving in a wide circle around the cabin, a perimeter, and the whole time I got this intense, skin-crawling feeling of being watched. It wasn't a vague paranoia, it was a specific heavy pressure, like a weight on my shoulders. I felt like there were multiple sets of eyes on me, from different directions, all at once. I'd never felt anything like that up there, not in all the years I'd been going. The woods had always felt neutral, indifferent. That night, they felt hostile. I stubbed out the cigarette and went back inside, my hands shaking so bad I could barely turn the doorknob. The next day, Saturday, was tense. I kept looking out the windows, jumping at every little sound. The woods were quiet, too quiet. Around midday, I heard coyotes start up. But it wasn't their normal yipping and howling. It was different. It was frantic, almost panicked. A series of short, sharp barks, and then this long, drawn-out howl that sounded more like a scream than anything. It went on for a minute or so, and then cut off abruptly, like someone had thrown a switch. The silence that followed was even heavier than before. I decided I needed to do something, to prove to myself that I was just spooking myself. I went outside to walk the property line. The ground was soft from recent rain, and that's when I found it. About 50 feet from the back porch, in a patch of mud near the woodpile, was a single long impression. It wasn't a clear print with toes or anything. It was more like a long, narrow depression, maybe 18 inches long and half as wide. It was deep, too, like something very heavy had stood there for a while. It didn't look like a bear track. Bear tracks are rounder. This was elongated, almost like a human foot, but way, way too big. I didn't have a ruler, so I put my boot next to it. My size 11 boot looked like a kid's toy next to this thing. I just stared at it, my mouth gone dry. I didn't take a picture. I don't know why. I think part of me just wanted to forget it, to pretend I never saw it. The rest of that day and all of Sunday were a blur of nerves. I didn't sleep much. Every little night sound had me bolt upright in bed. I kept the spotlight and a rifle my grandfather had left at the cabin close by. I felt like a prisoner in my own family's home. Then came Monday morning, the 11th, the day I was supposed to leave. I was packed up, ready to get the hell out of there. It was early, just after sunrise. The mist was still clinging to the ground in thick, grey patches. I was doing one last look around from the balcony, just to make sure everything was clear before I loaded the truck. I had the rifle with me, more for a feeling of security than anything else. I raised it, not to shoot, but to use the scope. It's an old but good scope, brings things in nice and clear. I panned slowly across the tree line at the far end of the field, maybe 150 yards out. The mist made it hazy. I was scanning past a big cluster of hemlocks when I saw it. My breath caught in my throat. It was a figure, tall, upright. It was standing just inside the tree line, half hidden by the ferns and the low branches. Through the scope, I could see it in terrifying detail. It was massive. Its body was broad and covered in what looked like dark, matted hair, but it was wet-looking, almost slick in the morning damp. Its head was an odd, elongated oval shape, sitting directly on its shoulders with no real neck to speak of. It was just standing there, perfectly still, and then it moved. Its head turned, not a quick animal jerk, but a slow, deliberate scan of the area. It was surveying its surroundings, and I knew with a certainty that turned my blood to ice that it knew I was there. It knew I was watching it. It wasn't looking directly at me through the scope, but it was aware. The intelligence in that movement was unmistakable. This wasn't some dumb animal. This was a creature that was thinking, assessing. I lowered the rifle, my hands slick with sweat. I was trembling all over. I raised it again, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. It was still there, just standing, watching. And then I heard the whistles. It came from my left. 4 clear, sharp whistles in a row. They weren't bird whistles. Birdsong is random, melodic. This was a signal, 4 distinct piercing notes. Wachit, 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 wachit. The sound cut through the morning air like a knife. My head snapped to the left, and I saw movement in the brush about 70 yards away, closer than the first one. I swung the rifle scope over. There was a second one. It was slightly smaller, but built the same way. Tall, powerful, covered in that same dark fur. It was moving through the undergrowth, and it was quiet, unnaturally quiet. It didn't crash through the branches. It moved with a fluid, almost graceful silence, parting the ferns and brush without making a sound. Then it stopped, and it sat down. It just sat. It found a fallen log and lowered itself onto it. Its posture relaxed, like a person would sit. It turned its head and looked right towards the cabin, right at me. So there were two of them, one standing at the far tree line, one sitting much closer, both just watching. I was frozen. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't move. I just stood there on that balcony, the cold metal of the rifle pressed against my cheek, watching them watch me. This went on for what felt like forever. I later checked my phone, and it was about 30 minutes. 30 minutes of this silent, terrifying standoff. They didn't make a sound after the whistles. They didn't move. They were just present. Their stillness was more threatening than any charge would have been. It was a display of control, of confidence. They weren't afraid of me, not one bit. My mind was racing. What were they? Every story, every legend I'd ever heard whispered about these woods came flooding back. But this wasn't a story. This was real. I was looking at them. I could see the way the mist swirled around the legs of the one standing. I could see the texture of the fur on the one that was sitting. This was flesh and blood. This was happening. The one sitting on the log lifted its arm, a long, heavily muscled arm, and scratched its side, a slow, casual movement. The normalcy of the gesture was what finally broke me. It was so utterly mundane, so human-like in the middle of this completely inhuman situation. That's when the full, paralyzing fear really set in. This wasn't just an animal. This was something that lived in a space between what I knew and what I couldn't understand. I knew I had to leave. I had to get out. I slowly, carefully lowered the rifle. I backed away from the railing, not taking my eyes off the spot where they were until I was inside the bedroom. I closed the sliding glass door as quietly as I could and locked it. I didn't look back. I grabbed my already packed bag, ran downstairs, and threw everything into the truck. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I didn't do a final walkthrough. I didn't care if I left anything behind. I just needed to be gone. I started the truck, threw it in reverse, and spun the tires on the gravel as I backed out. I didn't use the spotlight. I didn't look towards the field. I just drove. I drove down that dirt road as fast as I dared, the trees whipping by in a blur, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I didn't slow down until I hit the paved county road 10 miles away. I never went back to that cabin. My family sold it a year later. I gave some excuse about it being too remote, too much upkeep. I couldn't tell them the real reason. I'm convinced, completely convinced, that there's something living in those woods, something that stays hidden. There's a pond back behind the field, and the cover is so thick you could lose an army in there. It's their place. It always was. I was just a visitor who overstayed his welcome and saw something I was never meant to see. I still think about them sometimes, especially on quiet, foggy mornings. I think about the one standing guard and the one sitting on the log, just watching. I think about those 4 whistles. I never heard them again. I never saw those red eyes again, but I know they're still out there. And I know they know that I know. Story 17. So I've been sitting on this for a while, not really sure if I should talk about it, but it's one of those things that just eats at you, you know? I need to get it out there. This happened during a canoe trip I took on the Betsy River up in the Marquette State Forest in Michigan. It was supposed to be a 2.5-day thing, just me, the river, and some peace and quiet. I'd done solo trips before, never had any real trouble, but this was different. I'm only going to focus on that one day, the day everything went sideways, because that's what sticks with me, what I can't shake. It was getting toward dusk when I decided to pull over and make camp. The light was fading fast. That kind of soft, grayish glow you get in the woods when the sun's dipping below the trees. I found a sandy bank that looked decent, not too steep, with enough space to lay out my gear. I remember the sound of the canoe scraping against the sand as I dragged it up, and I propped my paddle against it, like I always do. Everything felt normal at first, just the usual routine. I was tired from paddling most of the day, my shoulders ached, and I was looking forward to setting up, maybe catching a fish for dinner. As I was getting my stuff together, I startled a group of white-tailed deer. 6 of them, I counted, that must have been browsing nearby. They bolted all at once, crashing through the underbrush, and the sound echoed in the quiet. It made me jump, but I laughed it off. Deer spook easy, nothing unusual. I set up my fishing pole, one of those collapsible ones, and stuck it in the sand near the water's edge. Then I started arranging my camp, rolling out my sleeping bag, gathering some dry wood for a fire later, just taking my time. That's when I heard this noise, like the fishing pole falling over. It was a sharp, clattering sound, and I turned to look, expecting to see it on the ground. But it wasn't. It was still upright, stuck in the sand like nothing happened. That got my attention right away. Why would I hear something like that if nothing moved? I felt a little prickling on the back of my neck, but I figured it was just the wind or an animal bumping something. I reached for my mini flashlight, one of those small ones you keep in your pocket, and clicked it on. The beam was weak, but it cut through the growing dark enough to see the fishing pole and the area around it. That's when I heard movement up the steep bank above me, maybe 20 feet up. It was a rustling sound, like something big shifting its weight, and I swung the light toward it, and that's when I saw them. 2 large, pale yellow eyes reflecting back at me. They were set wide apart, way higher off the ground than any animal I'd ever seen around there. My heart just dropped into my stomach. I froze for a second, just staring, and the eyes didn't move either. They were just fixed on me. I thought, okay, it's probably a timber wolf. I'd heard they were in the area, though I'd never seen one up close, but something felt off. The eyes were too big, too intense, and the way they held still, it was unnerving. We kept staring at each other, and I could feel my breath getting shallow, my hands starting to sweat. I didn't want to panic, so I decided to make some noise, scare it off like you would with any wild animal. I shone the light right on my own face. I don't know why, maybe to make myself look bigger or something. And I let out this low growl like a dog would. It sounds stupid now, but in the moment it felt like the only thing to do. And it worked. The eyes shifted, and I heard more movement, branches snapping softly, and then whatever it was moved away. I could hear it retreating up the bank, the sounds fading into the distance. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, and my whole body felt weak. I sat down on the sand, my heart pounding in my ears. I tried to convince myself it was just a wolf, nothing to worry about, but that feeling of being watched, of something so aware, it stuck with me. I stayed there for a bit, just listening, but everything went quiet again. I went back to setting up camp, but I was on edge now. Every little noise made me jump, the rustle of leaves, the flow of the river, even my own movements. I decided not to bother with a fire. I didn't want to draw more attention. I just ate some jerky and nuts from my pack, drank some water, and tried to calm down. The sky was fully dark by then, no moon out, so it was pitch black except for my little flashlight. I kept it close, my hand resting on it like a lifeline. Then, maybe an hour or 2 later, it happened. I was sitting by my canoe, just staring into the dark, when I heard something coming back to the bank. This wasn't the same as before. This was heavier, louder. It sounded like something big moving through the brush, not trying to be quiet at all. My stomach clenched up, and I felt that fear creeping back worse than before. I grabbed my .38 revolver from my pack. I always carry it on trips like this, just in case, and I held it tight, my fingers cold and shaky. Then it let out this scream. I've never heard anything like it. It was deep and sharp at the same time, powerful enough to vibrate through the air, and it came from right above me on the bank. The sound hit me like a physical blow. My whole body went rigid, and I felt this knot of terror in my gut, so tight I could barely breathe. It screamed twice, each one echoing through the trees, and I swear it felt like the sound was digging into my bones. I pulled the hammer back on the .38, the click loud in the silence, and I waited, pointing it toward where the sound came from. My hands were trembling so bad I could hardly keep the gun steady. After about 20 seconds, it screamed once more, shorter this time but just as intense. Then, nothing. Complete silence. Not a bird, not a rustle, nothing. It was like the whole forest had frozen. I stayed like that for what felt like forever, crouched by the canoe, gun aimed into the dark, my ears straining for any sound. But there was nothing. Eventually my legs started to cramp, and I had to sit down, but I didn't let go of the gun. I spent the rest of the night like that, awake, staring into the black, every sense on high alert. I don't think I slept at all. I just waited for morning, my mind racing with what it could have been. Not a wolf. No wolf sounds like that. Something else. When the sun finally started to come up, it was a relief. But I still felt jumpy. I woke up late. I guess I must have dozed off at some point, but I was exhausted, my eyes gritty, and my body sore from tension. I didn't even bother with breakfast or packing up properly. I just threw my stuff into the canoe and pushed off into the river. All I could think about was getting to the next bridge on State Route 115, getting off this river and back to somewhere safe. The whole paddle felt surreal, the water calm and the birds chirping like nothing happened, but I couldn't shake those screams. They were stuck in my head, playing over and over. I made it to the bridge by midday, and I've never been so glad to see a road. I loaded up my car and drove off. But even now, weeks later, I still hear those screams in my dreams. I don't know what it was, and I don't think I ever will. All I know is I was there, and it happened, and it changed how I see the woods forever. Story 18. This was back in August of 1995. Late August, I remember because the heat was just starting to break at night, but the humidity was still thick enough to swim in. My wife and I were driving back from visiting her sister over in Aiken. We'd stayed later than we meant to, talking and having a few beers, and we ended up hitting the road close to midnight. I was tired, but I figured I could push through the 2-hour drive home. We were on this back road, Highway 390, I think, just east of Sumter in Sumter County. It's a part of South Carolina that's just empty at night, dark in a way that city people probably can't even imagine. No streetlights, just the ribbon of my headlights cutting through this tunnel of trees, Spanish moss hanging down like ghosts. On either side of the road, it's just swamp and woods, a million miles of nothing. The air smelled like wet earth and decay, that thick, sweet smell you only get in a Carolina swamp at night. I had the window cracked, listening to the whir of the tires and the chorus of frogs and crickets. My wife was asleep in the passenger seat, her head leaning against the window. Our old Ford Taurus was humming along. A little too loud, maybe, but it was a solid car. The dashboard clock glowed a faint green. It was just past 1 in the morning. I was fighting a little bit of a drowsy feeling, just starting to set in, when I saw something move at the edge of the road up ahead. My first thought was a deer. You see a lot of them out there, and they'll freeze right in your headlights. I eased my foot off the gas, just in case, but it wasn't a deer. It stepped out into the middle of the road, right into the full glare of my high beams, and it just stopped, dead center. It was small. That was the first thing that hit me. It wasn't some huge, hulking monster. It was maybe 5 feet tall, if that. The proportions were all wrong, though. It looked like a kid. A 10 or 11-year-old boy, but covered in hair. Not shaggy, matted hair like you see in Bigfoot drawings. This was different. It was a dark brown, almost black, and it looked silky, like a healthy animal's coat. It was all over its arms and legs, and even on its face, but shorter on the face, so you could still make out the features. It just stood there, planted on two legs, and it turned its head and looked right at us. Not at the car. At us, through the windshield. Its eyes, they caught the light. They didn't glow, but they reflected it, a sharp, intelligent shine. It had a flat face, not pushed out like an ape's, but not human either. It was just this thing, this small, hairy, child-shaped thing standing in the road like it owned the place. My heart didn't just skip a beat. It felt like it seized up in my chest, a cold jolt, like I'd been doused with ice water, shot straight down my spine. This wasn't fear like seeing a cop in your rearview mirror. This was a deep, primal, gut-level terror, the kind that whispers that the world isn't what you think it is, that the rules you live by are a lie. My wife must have felt the car slow down, or maybe she felt the silence because she stirred. She lifted her head from the window, blinked a few times, and then she saw it. She didn't scream. She made this sound, a choked, guttural gasp, like all the air had been punched out of her. Her hand flew out and clamped onto my forearm, her nails digging in through my shirt sleeve. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice tight and thin. I couldn't answer. I was just frozen, my hands locked on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, my foot hovering between the brake and the gas. We were still rolling forward, maybe 20 miles an hour, just coasting closer to it. It didn't move. It just kept looking at us. Its body was lean, not bulky. The hair on its arms was smooth, lying flat. I could see the musculature underneath, like a gymnast's, and the way it stood. It wasn't like a man. A man stands with a certain posture, a certain balance. It wasn't like a monkey either, all hunched over. This thing was upright, but its knees were bent just a little, its arms held slightly away from its body like it was ready to spring in any direction. It was a posture of pure, wild readiness. Then it moved. It didn't run, it didn't lope, it jumped. One moment it was in the middle of the road, and the next it was just a blur of motion. It launched itself sideways, towards the passenger side of the car, towards the swamp. The movement was so fast, it was almost a flicker. There was no sound, no heavy footfalls, no crack of branches. It was utterly silent. I stomped on the brake. The old Taurus's tires squealed, and the car shuddered to a stop, the nose of it now right where the thing had been standing. The seatbelts locked, jerking us both forward. We just sat there, staring at the empty space in the road. The high beams illuminated the asphalt, the yellow line, and then the dark, tangled wall of the swamp beyond the shoulder. There was nothing there. "Did you see that?" my wife finally said, her voice shaking. She was still gripping my arm. "Did you see that?" I could only nod. My mouth was dry as dust. I felt dizzy. I put the car in park, my hand trembling so bad I fumbled with the gear shift. The engine was still running, that low rumble, the only familiar sound in a world that had just turned upside down. "What was it?" she asked, her voice rising in pitch. "A bear? Was it a bear?" I shook my head. I'd seen bears. This wasn't a bear. It was walking on two legs, I managed to croak out. It looked right at us. We both stared into the swamp. It was pitch black beyond the reach of the headlights. The sounds of the night, the frogs, the insects, had gone completely silent. That was the second wave of terror. The silence. When the woods go quiet, something is wrong. Something is very, very wrong. The air coming through the window no longer smelled just of swamp. There was a new smell, musky, earthy, like wet dog and old leaves. It was strong, and it was coming from outside the car, from the direction it had jumped. "Start driving," my wife pleaded, her voice a thin wire of panic. "Please, just go." But I couldn't. I was paralyzed by a morbid, terrifying curiosity. I had to know. I had to see if it was still there, watching us from the darkness. I reached for the high beam stalk on the steering column and flicked it, switching the lights from high to low beam. When the lights dipped, the world shrank. The road in front of us got darker, and that's when I saw it again. Not in the road, in the swamp, just at the very edge where the tree line started, maybe 15 feet from the passenger side door. It was standing half behind a thick cypress tree, one long, slender, dark-furred arm wrapped around the trunk. Its head was peering out from behind it. It was still watching us. A low moan escaped my wife's lips. She saw it too. She shrank back in her seat, pulling her knees up towards her chest. "Go," she whispered, this time with a desperate finality. "Go, go, go." My body finally listened. I slammed the gear shift into drive and my foot stomped down on the accelerator. The tires spun for a second on the asphalt before catching, and the car lurched forward. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just focused on the yellow line in the middle of the road, my knuckles white on the wheel, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack. I drove too fast, the car swerving a little on the curves. My wife was crying quietly beside me, her face buried in her hands. I kept checking the rear-view mirror, expecting to see it running after us, a small, dark shape gaining on the car. But there was nothing, just empty, receding blackness. We drove for 10 minutes in total silence before either of us spoke. The normal night sounds slowly returned, the frogs starting up again tentatively. The musky smell was gone, replaced by the familiar scent of the car, old coffee and vinyl. "What was that thing?" my wife asked again, her voice raw. "I don't know," I said, and it was the truth. I've turned it over in my head for years. A sick animal, a feral child, nothing fit. The silky hair, the impossible speed, the silence, the way it stood, the way it looked at us with such direct, unnerving intelligence. It was proportional like a child, but it moved with a grace and power no human child possesses. We got home just as the sky was starting to lighten to a dull grey. We didn't talk about it much after that. We told a couple of close friends, who mostly just nodded and looked at us like we were crazy. We never reported it to any official group or anything. What would we say? We saw a small, hairy kid monster in South Carolina. The memory of it changed over time. The initial pants-wetting terror faded, replaced by this deep, persistent unease. It's the look I can't forget. It wasn't a hostile look. It wasn't angry or predatory. It was curious, assessing. It looked at us the way you might look at an interesting bug under a microscope. That's what stuck with me all these years. We weren't a threat to it, and it wasn't in that moment a direct threat to us. We were just an event. Something interesting on a lonely road in the middle of the night. It left us with a peculiar feeling, like we'd been given a glimpse behind a curtain, shown something we were never supposed to see. The world felt thinner after that, like the reality I knew was just a veneer. And underneath it was something else, something old and wild and utterly indifferent to us. It wasn't the frightening memory I thought it would be. It was something worse. It was unsettling, a mystery that doesn't want to be solved, that just sits there in the back of your mind, reminding you that you don't know half of what's really out there in the dark. And sometimes, on a hot, still August night, when the smell of the swamp carries on the wind, I'll remember the feel of my wife's nails in my arm, the silence of the woods, and the sight of that small, dark figure standing in the road, looking right at us before it vanished without a sound into the black water and the waiting trees. Odanis Story 19. I still remember that day like it was yesterday, even though it happened back in late August of 1997. I was a non-commissioned officer stationed in Alaska, up near Fairbanks, and life on the base had become pretty routine. That particular evening, I was driving home with my wife and our young child in the back seat, along with my hunting buddy who'd come along for the ride. We'd spent the day doing ordinary stuff, running errands, grabbing a bite to eat, and nothing felt out of the ordinary. The sun was starting to dip low, casting long shadows across the road, and the air had that cool, crisp feel that comes with late summer in Alaska, where dusk settles in quick and the light fades fast. We were on one of the standard roads within the military installation north of Fairbanks, a route I'd driven dozens of times before. It's a narrow, paved road surrounded by thick stands of spruce and birch trees, with the China River running somewhere off to the east. The kind of place where you might see a moose or a bear if you're lucky, but mostly it's just quiet and isolated. I was behind the wheel of our old Ford Bronco, the one I'd had for years, and my wife was in the passenger seat while our kid was dozing off in the back, snug in his car seat. My buddy was sitting next to him, and we were chatting about nothing important, maybe hunting plans for the upcoming season or some base gossip. The radio was playing softly in the background, just enough to fill the silence. As we rounded a gentle curve, the trees thinned out a bit, and that's when I saw it. Up ahead, maybe 50 yards away, something massive stepped out onto the road from the left side. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe a moose or a grizzly, because we get those around here all the time. But this was different. It was tall, really tall, and it was walking upright on two legs like a person. But it wasn't human, not even close. I'd guess it was about 7 feet tall, covered in dark, shaggy hair that looked almost black in the fading light. It moved with this smooth, confident gait, not loping or shuffling, but striding like it owned the place. And it crossed the entire width of the road, I'd say about 35 feet, in just 4 or 5 steps. It happened so fast, but at the same time, it felt like everything slowed down. My wife gasped beside me, and I heard her fumble for our child in the back. She clutched him tight, and I could see her hands shaking out of the corner of my eye. My buddy, who's been hunting with me since we were kids and has seen just about every animal in Alaska, let out a low curse. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, and I didn't have an answer. I slammed on the brakes, not hard enough to skid, but enough to bring us to a stop right there in the middle of the road. The Bronco idled roughly, and for a second, none of us said a word. We just stared at where the thing had been, but it was already gone, vanished into the thick brush on the other side that leads down toward the China River. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and my hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel. I've been in tense situations before, military training, close calls in the field, but this was different. This was pure, raw fear, the kind that makes your stomach clench and your breath catch. I looked over at my buddy, and his face was pale, eyes wide with disbelief. We're both seasoned hunters. We know what bears look like, how they move. Bears don't walk upright like that for more than a few steps, and they sure as hell don't cover ground that smoothly. This thing had a purpose to its stride, like it was just going about its business, and we were the ones in the way. I put the Bronco in park and killed the engine, partly because I didn't want to draw any more attention, and partly because my legs felt like jelly. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of our breathing and the faint rustle of leaves outside. My wife was whispering soothing things to our child, who'd woken up and was starting to fuss, but I could hear the tremor in her voice. "Did you see that?" she asked me, her words barely above a whisper. I just nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My buddy leaned forward from the back seat, his voice low and urgent. "That wasn't a bear, man. I've never seen anything like it." We sat there for what felt like forever, but it was probably only a minute or two. I kept scanning the tree line, half expecting the thing to reappear, but everything was still. The light was fading fast now, turning the world into shades of gray and blue, and the shadows seemed to deepen around us. I could smell the pine and damp earth through the open window, and it should have been comforting, but instead it felt oppressive, like the woods were closing in. I remember thinking about how vulnerable we were, just sitting there in a vehicle on a deserted road. Military installation or not, this felt wild and uncontrolled. After a bit, I started the engine again and pulled over to the shoulder, mostly to get out of the way in case another car came by, but also because I needed to do something, anything, to shake off the paralysis. My buddy and I got out, leaving the doors open so we could hear if anything happened. The air was cool against my skin, and I shivered, though I wasn't sure if it was from the temperature or the adrenaline. We walked a few steps toward where the creature had crossed, and I could see the impressions in the dirt at the edge of the road. They were faint but unmistakable, footprints, but not like any I'd ever seen. They were large, maybe a foot long or more, and pigeon-toed, meaning the toes pointed inward slightly. I've tracked deer, moose, bears, you name it, but these were different. The stride was long and even, matching what we'd seen, and they led off into the brush. My buddy crouched down to get a closer look, and I stood guard, my eyes darting around the trees. I've never felt so exposed, not even in combat zones. Here, in a place I thought I knew, something had just shattered my sense of safety. He pointed at one of the prints. See that? No claws, no pad marks like a bear. It's almost human, but bigger, and the gait is all wrong. His voice was steady, but I could tell he was freaked out too. We both were. We're not the kind of guys who spook easily. We've spent years in the woods, dealt with aggressive animals, handled weapons, but this was beyond our experience. We decided to follow the tracks a short way, just to see if we could find more evidence, but we didn't go far. The brush was thick and tangled, and with the light nearly gone, it felt too risky. Plus, I had my family in the car, and the last thing I wanted was to lead something back to them. We found a few more prints in the soft soil, all pointing toward the river, and then they just disappeared into the undergrowth. Standing there, listening to the distant rush of the China River, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was like the creature had melted into the landscape, leaving no trace behind except for those eerie tracks, and the memory burned into my brain. Back at the Bronco, my wife was waiting, her face tight with anxiety. She asked what we'd found, and I gave her the short version, just that there were tracks, and they weren't from any animal we knew. She didn't press for details, and I was grateful for that. We all got back in, and I drove the rest of the way home in silence. No one spoke. We were all lost in our own thoughts. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those dark eyes staring back, but the road behind us was empty. When we got home, the normalcy of the house felt alien. The lights were on, toys were scattered on the floor, but it was like we'd brought a shadow in with us. My wife put our child to bed, and I could hear her voice trembling as she sang a lullaby. My buddy and I sat at the kitchen table, not saying much at first. Then he looked at me and said, "We can't tell anyone about this. They'll think we're crazy." He was right. In the military especially, you don't want to be the guy who sees monsters in the woods. They'd laugh us out of the room, or worse, question our fitness for duty. So we made a silent pact to keep it to ourselves. But later that night, after my buddy had left and the house was quiet, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the scene in my head, the way the creature moved, so fluid and sure, like it was part of the land itself. I thought about the tracks, how they didn't match anything in the field guides I'd studied. I've always prided myself on being practical, grounded in reality, but this shook me to my core. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown. It was the realization that there are things out there that don't fit into our neat categories, things that defy explanation. The next day, I thought about going back to look for more evidence, but I didn't. Something held me back, a sense of dread maybe, or the fear of what I might find. Over the years, I've heard stories from other folks in Alaska, whispers of big, hairy creatures in the wilderness, but I never paid them much mind until that day. Now, every time I drive down that road, especially at dusk, my heart rate picks up, and I find myself scanning the trees, half hoping and half dreading to see it again. To this day, I can't explain what we saw. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a moose, wasn't anything I've ever encountered. It was just this massive, upright thing that crossed our path and vanished, leaving us with a chill that never really went away. My wife and I still talk about it sometimes, in hushed tones when the kids aren't around. and my buddy and I exchange looks whenever the topic of strange sightings comes up. But we never went public with it, never reported it to the base authorities. Some things are better left alone, I guess. All I know is that evening in late August 1997 changed something in me, and I'll carry the memory of that creature with me for the rest of my life. A ghost in the Alaska woods that I can't forget.